And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. It's great to be here with everyone. What a fantastic crowd already. And we have a very special episode for you tonight, going into episode 44 now of the X-Steganography series. Of course, as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And we have some great things for you tonight. Keying in, if you were following our shows in November and December very closely, and the most recent show on the Hot Zone, then tonight you're really going to be comfortable with the background of the information. And if not, don't worry, it's going to be easy to catch up. Of course, those episodes concentrated very strongly on Ernest Hemingway and his presence in Cuba looking for Atlantis, and his brother founding something called New Atlantis, and all of the strange things that took place in the lives of the Hemingway family as a result of their association with this Bimini, Cuba hot zone search for Atlantis, which, interestingly enough, we uncovered this connection, which was quite remarkable, from Ernest Hemingway to Edgar Cayce, the American sleeping prophet, who said that Atlantis, in fact, was a lost civilization in prehistory that had advanced technology, and that its main city, main headquarters, their Poseidia, was located roughly where we call the Bermuda Triangle now, and extended out just that whole area of the Caribbean up to Bermuda. Interestingly enough, Cayce said that portions of this would start to rise, and that this would be an activity. And we're going to get into that tonight, and we're going to look at people who studied along this line and figured out what may have happened to Atlantis and how we're building towards something like that in the present, with the possibility of a massive pole shift. Now, the pole shift has been used for good measure in fear porn by various elements in the marketing and intel side, but we're going to look at it for real tonight and get a real feeling for what may have been the history there, looking at the continent of Antarctica through the figure of Professor Charles Hapgood, who was a Harvard graduate and also spent a great deal of his life at very, very high levels working on very, very sensitive projects, and finally breaking through on psychic research as well. So just an incredible overview that we're going to have for you tonight. This episode also is going to contain some information that's never been brought forward about Albert Einstein and his relationship to all this. Of course, one of the most celebrated scientists of all. And we're also going to bring forward a figure that Charles Hapgood, Professor Hapgood, worked with after Edgar Cayce died to try to get the same type of information. Someone named Elwood Babbitt, who was a psychic, again, here in the Boston area. And you're going to find over and over again, when you're going deep into these subjects, that Boston is going to be target zero for so much of it, and in terms of the mystery school activity and the larger implications of high tech and high politics. You're going to find them here, and it just so happens that, what do you know, we happen to be here too. A couple of quick things. I want to remind everyone, of course, to go to the Dark Journalist site to sign up for our free newsletter to keep you updated on these shows. We've been getting great feedback on that, and it's helping people stay in the pocket there, finding the show, which is very important, where we have all these social media crackdowns. And, we get messages all the time, right, Olivia, where it's just people are saying from YouTube that they don't get the message that the show is coming. And they signed up, they ring the little bell and all the rest of it, and they don't get the heads up. So it's very important for us to have that pipeline. So remember to go to darkjournalist.com and just sign up for the newsletter. And that way, we'll send you an email about once a week just to keep us all on the same page, and to keep our own level of communication going, regardless of anything that's happening on all these social platforms. Of course, there's so much going on in the news today that could pull us out of our center, and I will reference just briefly here the FBI's over-the-top Mueller raid on former Trump campaign person, Roger Stone. Of course, we've had Roger Stone on the show before. He's a political consultant. He's been known in various circles for his alternative take on things. And he's also in the past, all the way back to Richard Nixon, been a hatchet man for various types of political activity. And I'm sure this is a certain level of payback. But some of the things that I think we saw today with CNN set up in his bushes and like FBI snipers on the roof and stuff is just, there's an un-American feeling to it. And I think the political witch hunt and the raid and all this stuff is largely because, Mueller's investigation is largely castrated by the fact that he can't find any good information linking the Trump administration to Russia. So that whole thing just appears to be more of this internecine warfare that's going on between these groups. And whether you're on the right or on the left or in the middle, that kind of un-American, unconstitutional activity of these FBI raids and, this kind of thing. Is pretty unseemly. And we can see with the breakdown in government around the wall and around the Democrat shutdown and everybody playing for points and Nancy Pelosi getting rolled out there in her 80s and, forgetting where her lunch is. I mean, this is not a person who should be leading the Congress. So, she makes like Reagan with Alzheimer's look good. I mean, this was really someone who should not be in those levels of power. And this is what happens in those establishments. They cling on to the last breath. We recall very well with John McCain, far past being effective, was just hanging on in there. And this is why we came up with the idea of term limits, to get people to serve for 8 years and then move on, and I think that's an important thing to kind of get back to and reinstate. So,
Want
yes.
to take a question?
Sure.
Okay, Nimza right away says, who benefits from the unraveling of the American state?
Excellent question.
Mm-hmm.
Those forces that are in favor of transhumanism. It's a pretty easy answer. But there are deep state forces that seem to be at an all-time zenith right now, pushing into 2019. They're gearing up for the big showdown in 2020. And what they're doing is they're taking those characters and factors that helped turn the 2016 election, like certain channels in the alternative media. They're taking them off, and they're taking certain key individuals who were instrumental in that election for weal or woe. And they're taking them off the board as well. So Stone was caught up in that as well. And so Stone and Jones were a major block in the Trump camp, and now they're both pretty much off the board. So, and we've seen a lot of foolishness also around how these things get read. And we've seen a lot of, craziness that goes more into factions that we're seeing online. And I think that the alternative media is exhibiting a kind of disorientation right now, and the mainstream media is just full blast lies. So it's a very tricky environment to operate in, and we're going to continue to operate in that environment and bring forward these important stories. And I do want to say, interestingly enough, our story tonight about the hot zone plays directly into so much of the politics that have been playing out in the past 70 years right up to the present. So when we understand and find out about the hot zone, which is an area that lies between Cuba, the western tip of Cuba, and Bimini, and in this region, this is a very important place. And we'll see as these kind of geopolitical forces play out, just like right now they're talking about Venezuela's hiring out the Russians to put a base close by to Cuba again. And of course, that kicked off a massive Cuban Missile Crisis some 55 years ago. So, these forces haven't really moved on from that battle, because we've seen only the political surface, which is communism and, different dictators and things like that. But underneath it, especially in that region, this question of the hot zone becomes very important. And the hot zone apparently relates to something now about this whole theme that becomes an intelligence theme, a psychic theme, and a geopolitical theme. And that is this idea of a landmass rising off the east coast of the United States. We're going to put forward individuals, very high individuals in this regard tonight, from Professor Hapgood to scientist Albert Einstein, And we're going to see that it seems like everyone was working on this problem, including the Kennedy administration in the 60s and the deep state over the course of the past several decades. So we're looking at a major issue that is not very well understood, and I'm going to spend the time and go through it in the next couple of episodes to make sure we all understand what the hot zone is, what it represents, who the players are. And by the way, some of those players that have brought this out have really been burned badly, and I need to point those out too in order for us to create a kind of safety net around them so they can continue their work. Of course, I've been studying this for many years, and I was lucky enough to run across someone who was deep in that world of oceanography and had been hired out as a contractor for various independent non-government agencies to do explorations. And they informed me of something that lay there in the ocean that is called a hot zone, that is in this area directly that we're studying here between Cuba and Bimini. Now, they referred to it as the hot zone. As we know, we've done a number of programs on the underwater ruins off of Cuba, the western tip of Cuba, San Antonio, Cuba. And those ruins actually represent a very ancient civilization, and they were announced even in mainstream media in 2001. The New York Post, the New York Times, the Washington Post all announced this discovery. It's not something that was dreamed up. But little by little, they were able to suppress it, and I'm sure there were some non-disclosures involved. And one of the key figures involved, Paulina Zalitsky, who is a scientist, engineer, oceanographer, who runs a company called ADC out of Canada, had discovered these ruins, and some very, very interesting things happened to her along the way. Now, what's interesting is, as you know, as we study X and the X steganography that goes on through these government programs that are kept secret, in doing that, we run across over and over again the UFO file. And in dealing with the situation about the hot zone, again, we're dealing with the UFO file. So that kind of is going to give us a pretty good entryway into what's going to happen tonight. And I'm excited to get into it. Of course, last week we had a recorded show with Dr. Joseph Farrell on the Secret Space Program. And for subscribers, I do want to say that part 2 of that show is coming out on Sunday. You're going to have that in your inbox in addition to this show, of course. So you get a lot of material there to work with for sure. And before I launch into this, Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
Doing great. Something really interesting just happened. Jim Roy the Heretic says
Yes.
Babbitt had a spirit named Dr. Fisher who came through Elwood.
Yes.
He had a reading with Dr. Fisher in 1983.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Interesting. Well, we'll be very interested. If you want to write to me at info@darkjournalist.com about that reading that you had, I would be very interested to hear about it. Spent a lot of time on Elwood Babbitt. Elwood Babbitt, I have a picture of him here. This is a picture of Charles Hapgood, who put forward a theory in the 50s about crustal displacement, and he kind of created solid scientific background for the idea of a pole shift taking place in our ancient past and possibly heading into the future. During the course of his research and the many books that he authored, about a dozen books, he developed an intense interest in hypnosis and in psychic phenomena. And he had spent time studying. He had even visited the Cayces when they were working before Cayce died. So he was very, very keen into this early on. But later on, by the time he got into the 50s and 60s, he was thinking, well, where can you go for this kind of information? And actually, I believe it's a lot of the Cayce readings that tipped him off to this in the first place. But one of the things that he came around to was this person who was kind of like a Cayce named Elwood Babbitt, who operated right here in Boston, and he spent many decades working with him. This is a picture of the two of them together, with Hapgood on the right, nearing the end of his life, which mysteriously ended in a car crash, and Elwood Babbitt here, who is a largely not very well-known psychic, kept a low profile, and is certainly not as celebrated as some other psychics like Hurkos, but his dramatic ability to channel in different entities and provide different types of information were quite remarkable. He would go into a psychic trance and for years gave discourses on subjects, including the pole shift and including Atlantis rising. So he was right in the heart of this. And I would say that Hapgood tried for years to get information out of him relating to this. And I don't know, from reading all the material, I don't think that Babbitt got up to the level of like an Edgar Cayce, who was so specific about dates and regions and could talk about the different strata of the Earth. It seems to me that the forces that came through Babbitt were speaking in broad strokes about things, but certainly fascinating. And having done it for over 40 years, one of the interesting things about Babbitt, which I find quite fascinating, is that Babbitt, when he was 13, had a very severe accident and was basically on his deathbed. And his deceased grandmother came to him and told him that he was going to survive and that he'd have this extra ability as a result of having gone through this. And of course, we're going to meet a few psychics tonight who had a rather dramatic incident and then would prove to go on to very psychic experiences. Yes.
Esoteric 369 Wall says, was he a spiritualist, DJ?
Elwood Babbitt? Absolutely.
I think Hapgood.
Oh,
Would you call
Hapgood.
him-
Well, you know what's interesting? I'm glad you asked that question. Hapgood, even though he's a scientist and grew up in a very, kind of rigorous scientific education, his parents were both spiritualists. So especially his mother had that influence on him. So he was open automatically to this whole other window of activity. And, when we run across this quality in people, and we certainly run across it. I mean, one of our hosts tonight, one of our moderators, Carly from Dimensions and Beyond, has this incredible ability to go into psychic regions and extract information. Gigi Young, of course, who's joined us many, many times, is one of the closest friends and allies of the X series. These are people who can tap into these other places. And when you've spent time with them and you see that process take place, you couldn't doubt that psychic ability exists. And you couldn't doubt that, these things take place. So I think that made a very big impression on Hapgood. And it's an excellent question in this regard. What's fascinating are the allies that he developed when he was formulating his theories, and also his study of the ancient sea maps. And, I always say, Olivia, start off with the TKO, of course. Well, how would you like it if I told you that Hapgood was working with President Eisenhower to get the original copy of the Piri Reis Map?
That's pretty amazing.
And it's on record. It's not something we have to guess at. It's not one of those, hey, Eisenhower met with aliens things where there's no trail, but it's an interesting story. Well, here we have on record, Eisenhower working on behalf of Hapgood with the government of Spain, oddly enough, trying to get this map. And we're going to get into that tonight, so don't worry about it. One thing I do want to mention here is that when we talk about exteganography, I usually choose one good example from the past, and I rely largely on the mystery school activity to do this, because the exteganography, which is this symbolism that is used to move secrets around where these initiates can view the secrets, was eventually adopted by the United States government to move secret projects through different various government agencies. But the technique had developed a long time ago, earlier through the mystery schools. And this is something I found very fascinating, having studied both, to see them each adopting this secrecy technique. But of course, it's Annie Besant and her leadership of the Theosophical Society, which, with Colonel Olcott, after Helena Blavatsky died, who had started the Theosophical Society, and they're performing an X ceremony. That one's in India. But the X is this secret that's been passed down relating to a massive event that took place in prehistory. And this event very well could be related to this pole shift, as we'll find out by reviewing some of the Cayce readings tonight. But it produced this effect that I've termed here in this program apotheum, A-P-O-T-H-E-U-M, which goes back to a Greek term, and it's actually one of these words that pops up in history and then disappears, and you can't really find it sometimes, and then there it is. One thing I I noticed about it is it seemed to capture this idea exactly, that there was some runaway physics, there was something that was unleashed in this massive destruction, and that this is what relates to that mystery school secrecy that's been held so long. And they use the X-steganography over and over again to communicate metaphysical truth, cosmological truths, and physical, actual physical properties and physical technology on the ground that they wanted to keep secret. Think Ark of the Covenant, these types of things. So that'll get us kind of in the ballpark for the conversation tonight. There's a major psychic aspect as we look at the science of it. And, you can imagine just that some people we could get into a huge debating society tonight on the science of the pole shift. That's not what this show is about. I have heard some of those and they're good. Tonight is about putting the pole shift in the concept, in the context of the work of Albert Einstein, Charles Hapgood, and Edgar Cayce, and how all three worked together to achieve some kind of a view of this massive incident that happened, and how that relates to two places, Antarctica, one, and the hot zone, the other, and how we figure out the truth of either by understanding each. This is really where we're going to head. So let's get into it now. I can take a question here.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on Jim Roy,
Yes.
who said that Babbitt left the spiritualist church and went off on his own. He was a heretic, and everything that Babbitt predicted for him came true. The best reading he ever had.
Really?
Yeah, that's
wow.
Amazing.
Well, we should let's play our audio clip of what Hapgood has to say about his meeting with Babbitt, and of course Babbitt, I think, being his replacement basically for Cayce after Cayce had died. And, in truth, Hapgood was still quite young by the time Cayce had died. He's still in his 30s. And he had so much information that he wanted to work with that I think he looked for years for someone, and he was lucky enough to find Elwood. So let's play that about Elwood Babbitt that gives us Charles Hapgood's own statement. Go ahead.
One of my students at Keene State College told me that we had started going into this because we had taken up hypnosis. I'd gotten interested in hypnosis, and we had done some age regression of some of the students back to previous lifetimes. And so then I had become really interested in psychic matters. And this student said to me, there's a psychic living down here in the window. We ought to go down and see him. Which we did, and that was when I met Elwood.
Fascinating. So this is Hapgood now on the record talking about how he got to know Hapgood in the first place. And I think that, he wrote many books on Elwood Babbitt, and he, it appears that his cousin, Beth Hapgood, who was also features in all this, because she is quite remarkable, and she was a major mover and a shaker for Alice Bailey's work. And she also had spent several years at Findhorn. So we have these people really working in that, trying to move the culture forward, trying to inject, this incredible knowledge into the culture. And they're coming from, this elite strata of incredible education. In Beth Hapgood's case, her parents were diplomats and she grew up in Europe. And, so the Hapgood family certainly has these incredible roots, but these were people unlike sort of modern elites who seem really hell-bent on harvesting the culture. And things have become very, you could say, cannibalistic on the side of, and very greedy. And I think that there was a point here, though, we're talking about this period where there were groups who were coming forward, very much like the Kennedys, for example, who were from elite families but wanted to move the culture forward and were willing to make the same types of sacrifices. And so we have that kind of noble spirit that is riding through the Hapgood family. I want to say about Charles Hapgood, he was obviously an extraordinary scientist, and that is based on the words of Einstein, who I'm going to quote here. So just a little visual run-through of who we're going to be speaking about tonight. This is Professor Hapgood. There he is looking at a figurine that he found in Mexico. We're going to talk about his archaeological work. Of course, psychic Edgar Cayce, who gave readings on Atlantis, gave us the real roadmap, and certainly was influenced dramatically by the mystery schools and was a major figure for bringing the mystery school information online. And we have to remember that in Cayce's case, he really, interspersed his work on the larger psychic picture with his healing work and his medical readings. And so he had that real combination of attunement to the psychic circles and then the second half of that, which is service. And that's what we miss so often now. You get the people with the attunement, but there's no service involved. So it becomes very, very interesting. Cayce definitely had the balance going where so many of his readings were dedicated to health. Here's an interesting picture of Albert Einstein, the most celebrated scientist of the 20th century, celebrated mostly for his theory of relativity. There he is, interestingly enough, sitting with someone who many of you will find very interesting, having watched the X series with his Arthur Compton. And Arthur Compton, according to physicist Robert Sarbarker, was the person who inherited the UFO file from Vannevar Bush. Very interesting company, I would say, to keep. In any case, 2 Nobel Prize winning scientists there. President Eisenhower is going to come into the story as well because he worked directly with Hapgood in trying to obtain information on a very special map, which we've heard so much about, the Piri Reis Map. But there's some very interesting things about this, and one of the main figures who brought it forward was Hapgood. But apparently the Piri Reis Map was just a copy of a much larger map that had other functions to it. And it was so sophisticated, and there were rumors that it had existed and was available. And there was an account actually from 1895 that it had been put in the Spanish archives. And so this became a quest between Eisenhower and Hapgood to get their hands on this map. And many people said they wanted their hands on this map because it was the original map that Columbus used to find America. Okay, fine. I think a much better reason for it, since one of the most unusual things about the Piri Reis Map is that it shows the Antarctica, a continent of Antarctica with no ice on it. But one of the interesting things about this map that I believe a larger version would show, and why they were after it, is it may have demonstrated this hot zone and where it was and what to do about it. I think there's a good reason to suggest that this is why presidential power was invoked. Just as presidential power was invoked under President Kennedy with the widow of Ernest Hemingway, Mary Hemingway, there, after Hemingway had passed away, and they needed to get the vault of information that Hemingway and his brother had stored away in Cuba studying this Atlantis research. Yes.
I've got to ask this question. Okay, so Grandma Tippy Toes says, please ask DJ if he thinks the Piri Reis map might have invisible ink on it or a code of some sort. Maybe that's why they want the original.
It's great. Well, there's the real steganography for you. It is quite an unusual map, and I've spoken, there's a great show that I did with Graham Hancock, maybe 2 years ago now, but it's on the channel, and it's about a pole shift, and there's a big section in there on the Piri Reis map. And of course, I've had many conversations on and off the air with Joseph Farrell about the Piri Reis map, and he does say over and over again that the person whose possession it was in was Columbus. And Columbus, we know, was hooked in deeply with the mystery school connected with the Templars. As a matter of fact, they had been making these journeys over to America for centuries before Columbus got around to it, and it was announced, hey, the New World is there in 1492. There's evidence, of course, for the Templars having visited here in the 12th century. So, along with some Vikings too. So certainly the discovery was something that was more like the announcement. The discovery had happened a long time ago. But certainly there are keys and mysteries associated with the Piri Reis map. Absolutely. And I think that in looking at any of these, it's all about using this ancient material to get lifted out of the fog of what we've made of the history and what the establishments have made of it. Just like when you get into Egyptian prehistory and you realize the majority of it was set up in the 18th century before we had sophisticated instruments to study these things, but they want to leave it there because it's become the institution of Egyptology. They don't want to say, oh, the dynasty setup was wrong, or the years were wrong, or the families were wrong, because they've invested so much time and energy that way that it would just blow them out of the water. So we have real problems when it comes to bringing forward new archaeological facts. Just ask John Anthony West, Graham Hancock, Robert Ball, and Robert Schock. There's an establishment there, and some of them may even know and be looking for these changes themselves, and they may not want to share the credit with how the dates get changed. But where the state of archaeology now, where it sits, I think is very uncomfortable. Of course, Göbekli Tepe is an established site from 12,000 years ago. So, this idea of hunter-gatherers before 6,000 BC, now you've got to deal with 10,000 BC. What are you going to do? Well, you put out National Geographic books on it, and magazine articles and stuff, but you don't answer the question. You just kind of leave it hanging out there. No, they don't. So Graham Hancock has a phrase about this, which is things just keep getting older, and it's true. But in the case of the Piri Reis Map, it becomes quite unusual, and I'm going to explore that in detail, including quotes from Hapgood related to this. The first quote, though, that I want to start with tonight, and you can keep rolling there, Miss Olivia.
Mm-hmm. Do you want a question?
Sure.
Okay, so Lee Johnson wants to know, will Atlantis rise or will the pole shift expose it?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say it's kind of a combination activity. So as the pole shift is happening, then we're introduced to a number of different Earth changes taking place. Now, one of the things that happened, I believe, in the 1970s and the 1980s is a number of books came out and they said pole shift or earthquake or ice age, whatever. And there was all this shock value around it. And then there's another wave of this. And now we see a lot of that on YouTube or other places. What happens, though, I think in that period is they're trying to take the information that's rising and apply it directly in their time. Like, what will we do if there's a flood? What will we do if there's an earthquake? What will we do if there's a pole shift? And oddly enough, the information, in fact, from the mystery schools coming through the normal society suggests more that they were talking about something out there. They were moving it more into our time and beyond. That there was a kind of a, the reason that there's so many things from back there where it's like, we'll all be underwater in 1995 or something. There were all these predictions and the year 2000 craze and all this stuff. So there was a great push on the marketing side and on the intel side to kind of create confusion and make money. But I think that, in fact, when you study the actual information that was coming out from deeper sources, that it's this period of time, and I would say between here and the next 50 years, that we're looking at so many of these changes coming into a place where we can appreciate it. Extreme weather patterns, extreme earthquake patterns, learning to live off the grid, all these different types of things come more into play now. And part of the reason for the letdown of this, kind of earlier period where everyone was looking for these things, they probably should have been studying them. And this is my deep review after going through a lot of those books, like Late Great Planet Earth and all these things that were crazes in different periods. It seems to me that they were off time-wise to a large degree, and that now is a much better time to be looking at these things. And again, I think minus the fear porn, just get right to the point. And some of the biggest videos that you'll see come out will be like Nibiru hitting any day. Remember those? I mean, you see those coming all the time. You're like, hey, Nibiru's coming. And it's going to hit and like it'll knock the grid out and all this stuff. Look, these are things that are possible and things that need to be studied, but they can't be exploited and understood that way. So we need to develop a kind of a class of an audience of observers that knows these things and understands the kind of legacy of the mystery schools. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox on that. Miss Olivia, go ahead.
Well, you're probably going to address this, but Bo Krills wants to know why does DJ think Eisenhower wanted that map? Operation High Jump involved?
Well, it's an excellent point that Admiral Byrd's expedition to Antarctica, and we're going to touch on Antarctica, as you'll see here as we get into Einstein and Hapgood. Of course, when he went there, what did he report on his major expedition to Antarctica? That there were flying discs all over the place. And he gives an interview saying the next war is going to be with whatever that is down there. And then they hush him up, and very unusual things happen. And they're all very unusual connections to Admiral Byrd's Operation High Jump that will ripple, including the strange death of his son years later, found in a warehouse after his father's death. So, some incredible secrets around the Byrd family, including the fact that his cousin, Dryhole Byrd, D.H. Byrd, owned the Texas School Book Depository in Texas, where the assassination of President Kennedy took place. So, there's unusual connections there with the JFK assassination and the Antarctica search, which you're looking at it, you're saying, how does that make any sense? When we go deep into this tonight, we're going to come up with more characters from that, and it's going to make even less sense. If that's something to look forward to, yes.
Why Eisenhower?
Well, Eisenhower, I think Eisenhower had the ability as a military person to understand that political secrets are kept, and he wanted the real deal. And working with people he could trust, like Einstein and like Hapgood, this is, in terms of getting to the bottom of it, I think it's quite significant. My own personal slant on this, and I think I can prove it, is that the reason they wanted the full version of the Piri Reis Map was because the full version will show that area in the Caribbean that is the hot zone. And that is something that I think was perplexing them. And remember, this is before the Cuban Missile Crisis and before some of those issues, but we had people like Hemingway deeply involved in the search for Atlantis in this area. And I have major journals here from people like Egerton Sykes, who show that the Cuban Archaeological Foundation in 1952 announced that there were ruins off of Cuba. And so, they've known about this, and this idea of Cuba as Atlantis has been out there. But the hot zone apparently is the part that is already in the ocean and doing very unusual things with electricity, with current, and possibly even with dimensional distortion, which we're going to talk about as well. Yes.
Andy B. wanted to say, don't forget, Ike was Army Chief of Staff during Roswell, so he knew about the UFO file before he became President of the United States 5 years later.
Yes, Eisenhower definitely knew deeply about the UFO file. And he dealt with it, we know from the very significant whistleblower who came forward at the end of his life, that Eisenhower had threatened the CIA with invading Area 51, which he set up, after all, as a secret facility in the Nevada desert. Okay, so I want to read a quote here. Those are great questions, by the way, and thank you. You're watching Dark Journalist, everyone. It's fantastic to be here with you. It's a great crowd, a huge crowd, and we have so many fantastic people out there. I want to mention also that in the second half of the program, we will take questions for a whole Q&A section coming up, and put the questions in caps, and that's going to help us sort them out. And it's amazing the way that Olivia can sort those out. I still don't know how to do that. It's an extraordinary ability. But if you've seen her drive in Boston traffic, this is somebody who knows how to do it. But certainly, I think that one of the main things we have to keep in mind with the questions is, let's stay on topic. Let's stay right in the hot zone. Let's stay with Atlantis, Antarctica, Hapgood, and Einstein. This is rich material, and I'll tell you, I'm going to have to do this over the course of several episodes, very much like we did the Hemingway reveal, which is quite significant. And there's some very unusual things that are going to come out of this. It is literally one of the most explosive investigations, I think, that we've taken on. And so let's get a piece of it. This is very, very interesting. Now, one of the main things that Einstein did was promote Charles Hapgood, who was a scientist in the same period. But it's funny because in Einstein's own words, he didn't really promote other scientists that much, but he was so impressed with the work that Hapgood was doing around this idea of crustal displacement pole shift. And the idea that the Earth is basically like the skin of an orange, and that when that skin shifts, the Earth would still stay there, but all the stuff on top would move, pushing these things that had been in a kind of tundra climate into a tropical area. And that kind of fast disaster. And we've seen so much of this, including the woolly mammoth who was still eating kind of warm.
Buttercup.
Exactly, he's eating buttercup, and then he's frozen out. So whatever it was happened in an instant. And there's a lot of people who are in favor of these theories about disaster from 12,000 years ago coming from a comet. And I think that there's significant information about this. But the disaster that I'm interested in regarding Atlantis works like this. There's 3 separate disasters, according to the mystery schools, that happened to this incredible island continent, which stretches between the Mediterranean on one side and the Gulf of Mexico on the other. And one of the big breakups that happens splits it into 3 islands. One of the islands is over by Spain, one of the islands is over by the Bahamas, and the other one's over by Ireland. And you get 3 kind of distinct cultures there, but the main headquarters, the kind of driving force, was Poseidia, especially closer as you get closer to the Egyptian civilization, to the Mayans, to the Incas. And that Poseidia itself, in the Cayce readings, is where the main technology comes forward. So this is something, they had been the cumulative kind of inheritors of the major technology, and that there was a major split at that point between 2 groups. And the Belial group, Steiner would call the Ahriman group, Cayce called them the Belial group. Ahriman Belial versus the Emilius, children of one. So those 2 groups, one of the groups wanted to use technology to achieve spiritual enlightenment. Somehow through the technology they could do that. That's fascinating, by the way. That's a legacy of the mystery schools. That information, what is that all about? How do you achieve spiritual enlightenment through technology? But the other group simply wanted to use the technology for aggressive domination, and they got away with it. And in the end, it blew up in their face because by using these advanced technologies, they caused a major cataclysm, and it eventually sank the island. And Poseidia sank off of where Bimini is now. So when we get into that area and we get into the Bermuda Triangle with all the disappearances, there seems to be something dramatic operating there, which is not very well understood. By the way, it's been studied very deeply by covert projects within government. And it's not as, over the top as just, hey, that wild Bermuda Triangle. But the hot zone relates to that, but has not been brought forward as much. As a matter of fact, as soon as it was discovered and brought out there in public, it was largely suppressed by the mainstream media. And we're going to see just how deep that suppression went through the figure of Polina Zalitsky. But first, I'm going to read Einstein's quote about Hapgood. And let's read this now. Quote, Albert Einstein. I frequently receive communications from people who wish to consult me concerning their unpublished ideas. It goes without saying that these ideas very seldom possessed of scientific validity. The very first communication, however, that I received from Mr. Hapgood electrified me. Think about that. How do you electrify Albert Einstein? Let's think of the quality of work that Hapgood was doing. It electrified me. His idea is original, of great simplicity, and if it continues to prove itself of great importance to everything that is related to the history of the Earth's surface. A great many empirical data indicate that at each point on the Earth's surface that has been carefully studied, many climactic changes have taken place, apparently quite suddenly. There we go again with that sudden shift of the Earth and the crustal displacement theory. This, according to Hapgood, is explicable If the virtually rigid outer crust of the Earth undergoes, from time to time, extensive displacement over the viscous, plastic, possibly fluid inner layers. Such displacement may take place as the consequence of comparatively slight forces exerted on the crust. So forces build up in rotation, and at a certain point, too much force comes into the crust and it shifts. This takes place over the course of maybe 20,000 years. Such displacements may take place as the consequences, right. The consequence of comparatively slight forces exerted on the crust, derived from the Earth's momentum of rotation, which in turn will tend to alter the axis of rotation of the Earth's crust. In a polar region, there is a continual deposition of ice, which is not symmetrically distributed about the pole. The Earth's rotation acts on these unsymmetrically deposited masses and produces a centrifugal momentum that is transmitted to the rigid crust of the Earth. We can see what a great writer our friend Einstein is. Mm-hmm. The constantly increasing centrifugal momentum produced in this way will, when it has reached a certain point, produce a movement of the Earth's crust over the rest of the Earth's body, and this will displace the polar regions toward the equator. That's a major move. Without a doubt, the Earth's crust is strong enough not to give way proportionately as the ice is deposited. The only doubtful assumption is that the Earth's crust can be moved easily enough over the inner layers. The author has not confined himself to a simple presentation. By the way, the book is called Earth's Shifting Crust. He has also set forth cautiously and comprehensively the extraordinarily rich material that supports his displacement theory. I think that this rather astonishing, even fascinating idea deserves the serious attention of anyone who concerns himself with the theory of the Earth's development. To close with an observation that has occurred to me while writing these lines, if the Earth's crust is really so easily displaced over its substratum, as this theory requires, then the rigid masses near the Earth's surface must be distributed in such a way that they give rise to no other considerable centrifugal momentum, which would tend to displace the crust by centrifugal effect. I think that this deduction might be capable of verification, at least approximately. This centrifugal momentum should in any case be smaller than that produced by the masses of deposited ice. So this is the foreword of Hapgood's book.
So translate that for me.
Well, translate it for us all. I'll say one beautiful thing about Hapgood is that he wanted all of this to be understood easily by the layman. So he came up with that whole example of the orange. But the idea, of course, as many of us have run across this theory before of the pole shift, is that from time to time, over these thousands of years, force builds up and the poles change places. And when that happens, massive changes take place on the Earth. The crustal displacement theory has that orange skin idea where the whole thing shifts and all the land masses shift, even though the core of the orange stays the same. So, in fact, what Einstein is suggesting is that Hapgood's idea touches on something that he's thought of himself, which is this must take place over the course of thousands of years, and these basically the Earth, the crustal displacement must occur, and it must launch these Arctic areas into a more tropical zone, which is all fine and well for the continuity of the Earth, but it must drive the kind of regular human life on the planet absolutely crazy, because you're talking about earthquakes, inundations, changing climate. So many of us experience this now when we're talking about different things that happen. It's like, boy, it's like 50 degrees in the winter now. What's going on? So we see the weather changes. I think we can relate to that. But can you imagine being in somewhere like Florida and it just being all winter there all the time? I mean, it's a total change in a paradigm. And a lot of the mystery school activity in coming forward seems to be warning us that we're entering into this period again, and that we're going to be dealing with a massive shift. And that brings us to the work of Edgar Cayce, who in giving us this information, has often been portrayed as a kind of prophet of doom, but it's quite the opposite, actually. He's saying that these changes taking place give us kind of a new chance, in a sense, and they are part of the outgrowth of development of the Earth and our own development. And also largely suggesting that many of the disasters can be either predicted or averted. So, it's kind of like humanity is the master of its own domain. So that it gets very deep and cosmological. So when we're coming in with Einstein and Hapgood on one side, we're seeing the very scientific. But of course, both men attributed many things to other realms, especially Hapgood. And I grabbed this quote of Einstein just so we know he's not someone who is strictly on the scientific side. Quote, "The cosmic religious experience is the strongest and the noblest driving force behind scientific research." This was the kind of man that Einstein was. He was using that scientific information and getting cosmic spiritual realization from it. This is where he had arrived at. But oddly enough, the general push for scientific materialism would use the very information he developed to eliminate anything to do with anything spiritual. So we're in the middle of that clash right now, which is the clash that Rudolf Steiner warned was coming, which is the great battle between scientific materialism on one side and try to dictate everything that's going on with the transhumanism and efficiency and all the rest, and really distorting the rise of the computer age into this domination age instead of the flowering of new culture, for example, versus the mystery school balance trying to feed out these impulses of spiritual development and large-scale development, the real development beyond just the scientific material development. So we have a real battle, and it's heading towards, every day it seems to head a little bit closer. Olivia, weren't you talking about them moving the doomsday clock up recently?
Mm-hmm.
This is something I always find fascinating. It's all these experts they consult and scientists, and they develop the doomsday clock, I think back around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the idea was, how close are we to midnight on that doomsday clock? And, when Reagan was in office and there were all these things going on with the Soviet Union, and they were thinking, there's going to be a nuclear exchange, they'd move that clock closer. And then at other times, they'd lean it back. But recently they jacked it up. So they think that we're in a growing crisis. And, the way I look at it is it's inevitable that we face this question. And one of the things that I think is happening as we approach this question is that there's a group in society that is dedicated to keeping the larger group at a level where they can't understand the changes that are taking place. And so you get a lot of dumbed down information when you're dealing with the mainstream media in particular. Mainstream entertainment, of course, will also keep you in that zone. But people like Einstein, like Cayce, like Hapgood are trying to feed us this information. They're trying to get it into the culture. They're trying to get it into the literature. They spend their years on it. And all that information is there waiting for us, which is why it's such a shame when something runs away with the alternative community like Q or, like Flat Earth or Blue Chickens or whatever, because it's a tremendous waste of time, potential, and energy and intellect and money. So I think that what we need is to really take the time now and the opportunity to see that there is a change approaching, and depending on our responses to it in the grand scheme of things, the more information that we apply based on the efforts that these people have made in the past, from the mystery schools through the great political movements like the Kennedys, and through the different things that we've seen pushed through in society, that we can take advantage of a great body of information and work that they've left behind. And we're going to get into some of that tonight as well. Okay, so I'm going to jump into some information about Atlantis here, but I'm going to throw it over to Atlantis questions from Olivia. Or whatever you got.
Well, Jay Mallet was asking, what would a pole shift do to Antarctica? That's sort of the big question, right?
Yeah, that is going to come up. And again, it would have you living, just like the idea that at one point the Sahara was tropical. And this is reflected in the Cayce readings, that when these changes occurred, the shift is so dramatic that these areas aren't even recognized anymore, so that you can have this incredible tropical zone and now it's a desert, or you can have something that was polar ice caps, and with the crustal displacement it moves toward the equator. So you're looking at something like going from Antarctica to Costa Rica. It's quite remarkable when we look at it. But then again, do we really understand what the maps were telling us, and why were the big pushes around the maps? And we're going to get into Eisenhower's push on the maps. I did want to get into a little bit of Hapgood's idea about his own research about these pole shifts, about the crustal displacement theory, about Einstein. So let's just give a little bit of that here. And it was funny because one of the things that came up was there's a quote in the latest Solari report from Catherine Austin Fitz. And the quote is from William Shakespeare, but it's so applicable to this episode that I hope she doesn't mind me borrowing it.
As long as you cite it. I'm sure
Well, yes. And of course, she cited it from Shakespeare, and I will again here. There's a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea we are now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. William Shakespeare from Julius Caesar. Timing. Timing's very important. So when we get into something like the research that we're bringing forward here, based on decades of research by other individuals living and dead, they're giving us a platform. They're giving us the kind of way, the structure to understand the way into the future. And so we have the tools there. So we have the key, and then you turn the key and the door opens. So I think what's being really churned out by Shakespeare in that quote is he's saying, when this information is available, when the conditions are right, move. Because things can take off, like a world war can happen and slow everything down. A massive depression could take place and slow everything down. These things are possible. A pole shift could take place. But while the sun is shining, while the grass is green, let's make something of these things. And one of the key areas of information that we get from studying the exteganography is this hot zone. And the hot zone relates so much to our own prehistorical past that it's kind of a way of getting to know ourselves. And I think that's an important aspect of this. Very often when people refer to alien realities and things, there's a fascination with what could be out there and all this. But what would be really interesting, and why I think the Atlantis information is so wild, is it was a greater aspect of what we are. So you don't need any big-headed gray aliens for it. It is a direct extension, and by connection, a kind of ancestral thrust to our own prehistoric past. So therefore, the information that we have given down by the mystery schools who've kept the traditions since the Book of the Dead, since the Egyptian mystery schools, really 12,000 years passed down, probably, the kind of information that in the 21st century we can really apprehend and get a handle on and move forward with, really kind of like taking a good look at what our actual history is and finding the real roots to that. So let's get into some of that here. This is where Hapgood, of course, was coming from. And remember, in his quote there, he was saying, look, I had done all this research around the pole shift and done all this stuff with Einstein, but what was he looking for by the time he got into the 60s? Psychic research into hypnosis. He had realized that we were going to need this other factor. And that was his way of signaling that, I'd say, out to the culture. And I've realized that also because we can't just take financial information. We can't just take political information. We can't just take historical information. We need a way to thread it together. And that factor that's missing very often is what the mystery schools had, which was a kind of clairvoyant vision for how it all cemented together. And that quality, of course, is in everyone who's looking for those kinds of answers, the potential to be awakened, shall we say. Now, you have to balance this when you do the work that I do with a kind of journalistic overtone. So you have to get into the ideas without getting carried away by them. But when you are finding results in a particular area, then you're compelled to continue, shall we say. So I think that's what's going on here with Hapgood. Okay, so Hapgood had an interesting back and forth with some people who were studying his research, and these are books, these are letters at the end of his life about his books. This one, and a lot of this information you can find with the Flamath people who really studied hard and followed up on the work of Hapgood with their own books. They're quite good. This letter, dated August 3rd, 1977, was Hapgood's response to an enlarged version of a paper for Charles Hapgood. Quote, Hapgood to them, "I'm astonished and delighted by your article which arrived here. Believe it or not, it's the first truly scientific exploration of my work that has ever been done. You found evidence for crust displacement that I did not find. However, it would seem you're not aware of a book I published in 1966 entitled Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Since you're considering presenting your article to the Royal Geographical Society, of which I was a member, you may want to kind of peruse this. What I found after long research was that many maps considered of medieval or Renaissance origin are in fact copies of maps drawn in very remote antiquity. Okay. And among them is one showing a deglacial Antarctica. That is the Piri Reis Map. I was able to solve the projections of these maps with the help of a mathematician and have them confirmed by the cartographic staff of the Strategic Air Command at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts. These maps also contain much evidence to support the Atlantis theory." Now, it's interesting because as a scientist, he very often would take the projections of these ancient maps and bring them to people who are mapping the world, like this military Air Force base, and say, how does this add up with what you have? So he was just the master at bringing that information together scientifically so that we understood it, so that we would look at something like Piri Reis and not be like, haha, they didn't know how to even circle the globe, and in fact realize the incredible erudite capabilities that they had. As a matter of fact, some of the best conclusions of the Piri Reis map is that they had to map everything from the air, the way we would with a satellite now. So how were they doing that? You know, the Piri Reis map is from 1513, but the mystery schools that kept that he's talking about here, who had copied it over and over again, they had kept it for centuries and centuries because in the Atlantis times, they had that type of technology. So this is what he's bringing forward there. It happens that this is more, and he said there's a revised version of the map book is being produced in England. It's going to press in September. I've included about 20 additional maps in it because he was absolutely obsessed with getting the maps and understanding Antarctica, understanding the pole shift, and understanding these different things. He's trying to figure out in those ancient maps what they're showing us. It happens that a completely revised edition, right. I've included about 20 additional maps. I'm therefore mailing you a copy and will appreciate your reactions to it. It may be that after examining this book, you may decide to somewhat reduce your emphasis on Atlantis as a myth, for the book contains enough hard evidence to stand by itself. So he's saying you don't have to get into was it a myth or not. It actually, you can prove it as a fact by using the maps. And he's giving them that hardcore thing. Now, more information on this. Hapgood, of course, came to public attention in the mid-50s with his theory of Earth crust displacement, a radical geological idea which attracted Albert Einstein. Right, moving down. So in more of these letters, Einstein starts to have this conversation back in the 50s with Hapgood before he writes the foreword for him. So for 6 months, Hapgood gathered geological evidence to support the idea of an Earth crust displacement. On the 3rd of May, 53, he forwarded 38 pages of this evidence to Einstein. Central to his argument was Hapgood's evidence that Lesser Antarctica was ice-free at the same time that North America lay smothered in ice. And then Einstein responded from this 1953 letter from Hapgood like this: I find your arguments very impressive and have the impression that your hypothesis is correct. Here is, in effect, Einstein signing on to Hapgood's work, suggesting this pole shift had taken place. One can hardly doubt the significant shifts of the crust have taken place repeatedly and within a short time. Here he's signing on also, saying, not only does this pole shift happen, but when it happens very fast. Einstein wrote in December of 53 to Hapgood, urging him to address the centrifugal momentum problem and so on. They actually met in January of 55, and Einstein's last letter is March of 55 before he died. He actually, as they're saying here, they kept his archives are held in Jerusalem, and they hold the record of unique and unheralded collaboration on the theory of Earth's crust displacement. It's quite true, because Einstein we never think of in this capacity, but here he is helping Hapgood, who's thought of basically in the scientific community as a heretic. So, these major scientists have come forward and been on the side of a progressive look, an enhanced look at what took place in our prehistory. And of course, Hapgood's conclusions were that Atlantis was at the root of this. And here we have Einstein backing up Hapgood. In essence, Hapgood is getting, through Einstein, verification of his work on Atlantis. This is very significant because the scientific community will brush it aside, and largely the alternative research community seems to roll over it, but this is quite significant, and I think leads us into totally different territory where Atlantis doesn't become theoretical anymore. It becomes something totally different. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Oh, nothing.
Okay, why don't we play now something. Now, this is very interesting. Over by the Andros Island, we have something which is called the Underwater Area 51, but it's AUTEC, AUTEC, and we've got some very interesting information about AUTEC over the years. And AUTEC basically doing very secret work over there, and they are, in my opinion, most of their research is dedicated to exploring the hot zone and the ruins that are off Cuba. And that's a pretty good strategic point to be able to do it from. Now, one of the interesting things about someone who was a whistleblower who came out of AUTEC, he tells a very unusual story, which might give us an idea and a hint of what the hot zone is really all about. So let's take it from here. We're going to start with this whistleblower. He identifies himself, and then we'll take it from there. Go ahead, Miss Olivia.
My name is Kurt Roulette. I'm a former AUTEC employee. On one evening, we pulled out of the dock here. Suddenly, out of nowhere, we had a radar contact pop up directly in front of our ship that appeared to be a landmass where no landmass should exist.
Okay, now this was on a program where he came forward on a History Channel interview, and I found 2 interviews with this guy, absolutely credible. But I'll tell you what's significant about everything that happened there is on his radar screen, the thing that he's reporting there is that a landmass showed up. Not a ship, not a submarine, a landmass. Suddenly on his radar, there's a landmass rising out of the ocean that's not supposed to be there. Now, AUTEC, the group, may be studying what's happening with this Atlantis rising, because it might not be as simple as land rising out of the ocean and above the sea level. It may be that there's something very, very unusual going on a dimensional level with the hot zone in relation to Atlantis reforming and redeveloping itself, and that some of the things that we're getting from the Cayce readings about Temple of Poseidon rising off Bimini, the things that they were studying there is that maybe this continent is somehow reappearing there, as this whistleblower from Autech let us know, intermittently in a kind of interface, that it's showing up dimensionally and rising, and then it's gone. And this is the thing that they're studying. That would make it the kind of incredible secret that you'd get all these geopolitical hotbed situations going on over, and why we've had so much trouble and so much focus. Now, remember when we were doing the Thomas Townsend Brown episode around New Year's, one of the things that we found out was that he spent a great deal of time working there in San Antonio, Cuba, which is right on the western tip of Cuba. Where are the ruins that Paulina Zalitsky, the oceanographer, who found the city off of Cuba underwater? Where was that? That was San Antonio, right off the tip. So let's take a quick look at Zalitsky's work and some of the imaging of the things that she was looking at under the water. Pyramids that look largely, according to her, like Mayan pyramids more than Egyptian pyramids. Now, one of the interesting studies that she had before she found those ruins were in these cave systems in Cuba, which shows these incredible spirals of an ancient recording an astronomical event taking place over 12,000 years ago. On one hand, you could say she's a technician, but she's also incredibly informed. And for my money, she was placed there originally to find these things before she defected to Canada. And she's absolutely had an incredibly hard time, and we're going to get into that. This is the tip of the region that we're talking about. And remember, the hot zone extends between that tip there, here's Yucatan, and there's Florida. So you're talking about Bimini and Cuba, and somewhere this is the hot zone. That's the area that we're talking about. That's where those ruins are. So we get a kind of a refresher of the incredible discovery that she made at 2,200 feet beneath sea level. So that's very, very deep. And I would say that, diving became an absolutely ridiculous idea, but submersibles, which is what they sent down with cameras on them, worked quite well. Now, I want to throw in something odd here, which is there's so much UFO activity around the hot zone, and we might be starting to get an idea of this, but oddly enough, Castro himself and his generals saw these enormous objects in that area of Cuba, and it was reported actually in the Express. This is a real story, and a couple of his generals came out talking about this in their bios when they died. And I've pointed out on this program about Fidel Castro's relationship with Hemingway and the Hemingway Vault and JFK's efforts to get it. There's something very, very unusual going on in this stretch of history relating to Cuba and relating to these revolutions and getting control over Cuba that goes far beyond, the mafia wanting to have casinos there. Mm-hmm. I think we can do better than that. But let's take a look at Zalitsky a little bit closer and why her work suddenly got muzzled, because I think it is quite important. Again, that's the little Cabo de San Antonio here. This is the area that we're talking about. And I think it's going to become more important as we do go forward in the X series. Of course, many of the glyphs in the cave, astronomical. This X glyph shows up over and over again in relation to this. And these are these wonderful cave systems off of Cuba and the western tip of Cuba here. And again, that's just more of just sort of a basic outline of it. Now, let's take just a quick look at Zalitsky, who we've profiled in this program a few times and who I have tremendous respect for, but there's obviously tremendous pressure and uncertainty around her situation. Now, this is Zalitsky, of course, Paulina Zalitsky, the oceanographer and engineer who found the lost city off of Cuba and came forward with those results in the early 2000s. And eventually, the mainstream media try to take her down by saying, well, maybe they're just leftover junk from the Cuban Missile Crisis or something. Last I checked, we weren't building pyramids underwater during the Cuban Missile Crisis, so that one doesn't wash. But I found an interesting story in trying to retrieve how Paulina Zalitsky was silenced around all this work, to the point where she didn't even mention the Cuban find in her biographies that she let out. And there was an unusual article in the Toronto Star, and the headline was, "Caledon Woman's Mexican Arrest Crazy, Lawyer Says." This article is quite fascinating. Ontario woman has been unlawfully arrested and detained in Mexico City, according to her Mexican lawyer and Canadian relatives. Paulina Zalitsky, 64, of Caledon, was detained Monday without a warrant in Mexico City, moments after stepping off an airplane. They actually used the picture of her for the article. And there she is on Acapulco Beach in 2007 with her dogs. She reached Mexico City by telephone Wednesday night. Garcia, the lawyer, told the Star that 5 police officers were waiting for Zalitsky at Mexico City International Airport. They whisked her into custody, and she was held at a district attorney's office until Tuesday. She's now being held at the Mexico City prison called Santa Martha Acatitla, which houses about 2,000 inmates. Zalitsky is facing fraud charges and awaiting trial. Garcia said the charges against his client are unwarranted, and her arrest was executed outside of the law. In fact, the charges were dropped, and the case apparently was some kind of weird smokescreen to try to kidnap her when she left the prison. So the story gets very, very deep and very unusual. What I'm going to try to do is just give us a few highlights to give us some idea. Remember, Zalitsky is the key scientist who discovered in the hot zone the lost Cuban city underwater, and came forward with that at a point where the media kind of couldn't. What could they do about it? She was coming forward with the story. What are you going to do? So Zalitsky is a very important figure, and she's been now off the coast of Cuba since 1968, working in oceanography. And she came back there after she defected in the late 90s under Fidel Castro to look for these ruins, ostensibly looking for shipwrecks, which I don't believe that story at all. Oh, she just so happened to find it. No, they knew it was down there. They just wanted to use the new high-tech equipment to do it. According to her husband and business partner, Paul Weinswig, his wife's arrest was orchestrated by Mexican businessmen. Okay, Zalitsky's husband is the son of a renowned composer and Order of Canada officer, John Weinswig. Zalitsky has worked extensively as an oceanographer, and in 2000 she led a team of deep ocean explorers that discovered underwater stone formations near Cuba, believed by some to be a lost city. So we know we're talking about the same person. Okay, so they made up some kind of weird cover story to get her into prison, and there's a follow-up story that I have that she got back for Christmas that year, and this happened a few years ago. But the headline for that one was "Home for the Holidays." And it just says, "Caledon woman's Christmas miracle is freedom from Mexican prison." This is quite dramatic action. And for my own investigation, is not unrelated to her work in finding this Cuban city and in the big muzzle that's been placed on her since all of these things took place. So we're looking at a total silencing of someone who really brought out most of the truth about the hot zone and the incredible ruins that are down there that represent this whole lost civilization and ancient culture. So the question for me becomes, why was all this pressure exerted on her? And it seems very obvious from the whistleblower at AUTEC, which is whatever it is that's taking place there, they don't want other people going down and finding these ruins, one, and this reappearing landmass. And somehow this is some kind of major secret. You know, they talk about Area 51 being a secret and everybody knows about it. It seems to me nobody knows anything about the hot zone, which is really quite remarkable. So if anything, I think we need to train our sights on the hot zone and the things that are taking place here, because it's a remarkable story. And Zalitsky, was leading the pack with this, bringing forward the idea we have found Atlantis. And she had the sonar screens to prove it. So This thing should have been poured over by major scientists. Instead, it's being buried and she's being thrown in a Mexican prison and barely getting out and back to Canada alive. It's quite remarkable. We have to look at it and understand how secrecy works at a state level, and understanding her defection originally from the Soviet Union and Cuba to Canada, and the amount of kind of power the Americans would exert over her at that point. And then the fact that she re-engages with Castro in the late 90s, produces these incredible ruins, finds the stuff, does all these programs about it. I just found a Reuters interview with her. And we have so many interviews with her. And there have been specials about this. It seems like this great, strange elephant in the room. Like, what, you know, what the hell's going on with the city of Atlantis under Cuba? I mean, what's going on with the hot zone? And, you know, why is the alternative research world running away on, you know, kind of fabricated stuff? We have a case here where we understand maybe why the mainstream is suppressing it. But how is this not coming into focus? Why aren't there scientists working on this in the public? Why aren't there groups doing expeditions in public? Why is the hot zone not even a blip on the radar until the Dark Journalist show mentions it? There's something dramatic cover-up going on with this information. And I think it puts us on a totally different level when looking at this. And now I've just read to you the key person in the entire investigation, who I kept wondering, why did she go quiet suddenly? Why did the story fall off the radar? And of course, if she wants to continue to be quiet about the story, I don't blame her. But I think it could be brought to bear in the public that if the right climate is created, that she could come forward and kind of not have to deal with the hassle of, you know, these weird things happening to her when she travels internationally. So we're looking at a really major situation, and it involves geopolitical activity. It involves years and years of research by different people like Hapgood around Atlantis. It includes psychic information by Edgar Cayce, and it includes the incredible legacy of Ernest Hemingway, who, after all, Castro said, "Oh, I couldn't have done the revolution without him. It was his books that taught me how to do it." And Hemingway kept his own studies of Atlantis in a capsule in his villa. And it seems to me that it's really basically his family that paid the price for it, including his granddaughter, who committed suicide and had very unusual things to say about the types of pressures exerted on the family. So definitely there's some kind of independent force working on this story and keeping it out of the mainstream and keeping it distorted in the alternative field. And we need to get to the bottom of the hot zone story and the bottom of the Cuban city if we're going to go anywhere in terms of understanding what's really happening. And we have to ask the right questions. The simple question in relation to the lost city off of Cuba is, where's the scientific inquiry? Where's the archaeological inquiry? Where are the expeditions? Where's the money funding these things? It's nowhere to be found in public. Privately, obviously, the governments and other forces are taking a look at these things. And if we don't get a handle on what that is, we'll never understand why there are all these geopolitical forces raging at each other in this very unusual area of the Caribbean. You know, it's quite interesting because when you look at it, a lot of it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Even this thing about a base from the Russians over there doesn't make sense. That's a very provocative thing to do. They're not going to do it for no reason. They're not going to do it just for to help Venezuela out. I doubt it. There are other ways to help them out without inflaming the entire region. So I think this is really where so much of the X research is taking us, which is, you know, what is the pole shift? What are the Atlantis ruins? What is the hot zone? What is the cover-up associated with this? So with that, I have more things to read, but with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Olivia for questions. And
well, first off, I think I asked you this week, Marta Lyall wanted to know who funded Zelensky's research originally.
Well, it depends what you mean by research, but the one case of her going to Cuba in 1998 to study, quote, ocean currents, and then after that to look for sunken shipwrecks. That was the Castro government, and Castro directly gave her an exclusive contract. Now, here's an interesting thing. In her biography, she compares Castro to Hitler and other dictators. She's no fan of Castro or his regime. And now that he's dead, it's an unusual thing because when she was there in 68, she was there as part of the KGB putting her there. She was somebody that the Soviets got and trained, and they realized she was quite a property. But she did, kind of details the abuse that she suffered, including sexual abuse at the hands of the KGB, who used her and wanted to use her as a honeypot to get more information in Cuba. And instead, she defected away to Canada. And obviously, that's an American intelligence arm that's controlling that. That's just the way it works. So she has this whole other life. She's an oceanographer in Canada, and she has this company, ADC, and they get this incredible contract in 1998. And when they get the contract, it's quite fascinating because it's Castro, where she's defected from Cuba and the Russians to Canada. Somehow, with this company, he's the one who wants her back in there. He may have known that she knew something about that area from being there in Cuba earlier. And he wanted her back. They had her in there, and they gave her exclusive domain to study that region. Then out of the blue, she says, I found all these ruins, and I found this Canadian city. And what did she find? Pyramids, sphinxes. I have a few quotes from her that I want to read, actually, so I'm glad that came up. I want to remind everyone that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. You can obviously see that we're going to be in quite a few different episodes over this information. And there's a lot of breaking information here. It's great to have so many people with us. It's a fantastic crowd. And how are we doing out there, Miss Olivia?
We are doing great.
Yeah, fantastic.
It's, there's a lot of different
takes on it. Yes.
Well, what it is you're presenting so many damn dots that it just takes you've got to present the dots and then you've got to connect all the dots.
It is. It's a connect the dots kind of thing. But this is something that we did in 5 episodes with Ernest Hemingway. And that information is now fueling another course of this. So we're going to solve a lot of the things we're presenting here, or at least raise them up to a point where people can understand the whole picture, but we're giving it to you in segments. This is a major segment, and I'll tell you, in looking at the hot zone activity and the work, as I think the hot zone is a major key to everything else that we're looking at, because it was Edgar Cayce who had said in relation to the Poseidia temple rising off of Bimini that this is basically hearkening a different understanding of humanity and its past. This is what we're talking about, and this is what they're trying to stuff down as fast as it can come up. A couple of quick things about Zalitsky that I do want to get on the record. And by the way, while I'm doing this, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. It's easy. Just pump your email and your name in there, and we'll keep you on our list. You'll get an email about once a week, and it's going to be the kind of thing really where we stay in touch and we don't have the interference of a social media platform being up and down. It just keeps us on that tip, and it lets you know which guests are coming up, which shows that we're going to do on which X series. There's going to be some very special X series bonus material coming up, which is why it's an excellent time to subscribe to Dark Journalist. Make sure that you do that. Support the show.
And the other thing is, I have to say, we're spending a fortune on books. So support the show and help us buy more books.
I think of it this way. We keep it really affordable. And actually, till January 31st, we're keeping it at last year's discount, which is really good. So now's the time to get behind the show. And, one of the main things that you want to think of there is, and I do this a lot myself, which is, I measure out the things that are taking place and where I want to put my support. And, one of the major questions that has to be answered is, for the things that are out there that are doing good work, are we putting enough behind them? And for all of us wanting a better world, and I look at the work of Catherine Austin Fitts and Joseph Farrell, or my friend Alexandra Bruce at Forbidden Knowledge TV. These are people with the brain power, the know-how, and the research skills, but also the ethics to bring about a better conversation, a better tone. And, that thing about timing that Shakespeare started us off with is absolutely crucial. The timing is now. Apathy or procrastination is not a good look in 2019. So get behind it, get behind the things that are giving you that kind of things, that kind of power and information. And getting behind the Dark Journalist Show, look, you're going to get great information. You're going to get great results working with the stuff. And we're going to be able to bring forward some fascinating X dialogues for subscribers. And it helps us bring the very best to you. So that's a win-win all around. And we try to keep it as reasonable as possible, for sure. But make sure you get on board, and also make sure you're in there with the newsletter. Okay, so just a quick overview on Zalitsky's find as we move forward here. Then we'll jump right back to your questions, Miss Olivia. Sorry, I forgot to do this one. Okay, Reuters article. Quote, most intriguingly, researchers using sonar equipment have discovered at a depth of 2,200 feet a huge land plateau with clear images of what appear to be urban developments partly covered by sand. From above, the shapes resemble pyramids, roads, and buildings. Okay, the Reuters article, again, it's stunning what we see in our high-resolution sonar images. This is from Zalitsky and people on her team. It's limitless, rolling white sand plains, and in the middle of this beautiful white sand are clear, man-made, large architectural designs. It looks like when you fly over an urban development in a plane and you see highways, tunnels, and buildings. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. That's not natural, that's not beach rock or something, what they try to say about the Bimini Road. She says, they said, do you think it could be something in nature? And she says, we don't believe nature is capable of producing planned symmetrical architecture unless it is a miracle. So that's when she was working off of East Havana. Now, what's interesting to me is that Hapgood, at a certain point in his own research, going back to Charles Hapgood for a moment, because I believe he's related if we look at this. Hapgood had spent a lot of time in an area of central Mexico looking at an incredible find. And again, the archaeological forces tried very hard, like with Zalitsky's find, to keep it down. But in this case, he had a very high-profile figure behind him who was someone that was very interested in the subject, but was also a famous individual named Earl Stanley Gardner. This is quite an interesting little aside. Earl Stanley Gardner is this character here. And he became a very famous trial lawyer, but he had worked in law offices for years, and he became a very successful Hollywood writer, and he wrote Perry Mason and the Perry Mason series. He became fascinated from living in Mexico by all of these rumors about a suppressed archaeological dig that took place by a German archaeologist who had received a lot of flack and been pushed around, but had found an amazing thing. We look at his find. Acambaro is the name of this find.
I think it's a Acambaro.
Well, yes, you have that natural Latin
6 years
roll.
Spanish.
Let's hear that again, Olivia.
Acambaro.
Acambaro. I'll do my best. These are some of the very unusual and interesting figurines that he discovered. To me, in looking at them, and the dating goes very far back, at least to 3000 BC, but probably much older. These are some of the most unusual figurines I've ever seen anywhere, especially. And they represent, obviously, that Atlantean link, but a very highly specialized group. You do not see these things very often in Mayan culture, let's face it. This one in particular struck a number of people unusual, and that it has that kind of saucer shape to it. It is quite unusual, let's face it. I don't think there's much that can be said about that. These are more figures from the site. Do you want to say the site again?
Acambro.
There we go. Very unusual site. And who was in charge of kind of getting to its authenticity? Charles Hapgood. This is very interesting, too, because Hapgood would go with Earl Stanley Gardner, who was interested in this, but the person who funded them was Arthur Young. And Arthur Young is a very, very interesting background, including as a scientist and also a deep interest in spiritualism. But he's the person who developed Bell Helicopter, who we talk about so much on this program. The collection itself is called the Gilsrud.
Is that all you're going to say about it?
No,
There's a lot more.
There's more coming.
Okay.
We can't go in depth on everybody.
Mm-hmm.
The warrior from the Gilsrud collection. The Gilsrud collection, this is the German archaeologist who found this material in the 40s in central Mexico. And this is one of those, this is clearly an Atlantean warrior. I mean, we're looking at a real pass down. These do not look like normal Mayans by a
This
long
looks
shot.
nothing like Mayan art. That's
Yeah.
for sure.
There's no question about it. So one of the there's a few results that they came up with around this, which I'm going to cite here. And this book is called Mystery in Acambaro by Charles.
Acambro. You have to get the accent right.
Listen, you're doing well with that. I like the Latin zing. Feel free to chime in. I'll say Mystery in Acambaro.
It's Acambro.
Acambaro. Thank you. You know she's going to get it. That's Olivia, everyone. She's going to nail the pronunciation of anything Latin. Everyone's going to be left in the dust. In attempts to irrevocably prove the authenticity of the collection, artifacts were submitted for scientific dating. When Teledyne's Isotopes Laboratories performed dating tests on the carbon deposited upon firing ceramic samples submitted by Hapgood, the dates 4530 BC were obtained. Okay, so that's at least 3,000 years earlier than the Maya. Okay, and that's far before the Olmecs as well. Arthur M. Young, the inventor of Bell Helicopter, who had sponsored Hapgood's investigation, along with Gardner, submitted Gilsrud's artifact samples to the University of Pennsylvania for dating. Radiocarbon dating performed by Dr. Froelich Rainey in the laboratories of the university indicated that this culture may have been developed between 6,400 and 3,500 years ago. So this is a straggler offshoot of the Atlantean group, closer in date to the destruction of the Atlantean group that went to Yucatan and moved their way down the line. Additional tests were performed. They produced dates up to 4,500 before present, or 2,500 BC. So there are obviously some younger ones. All of these results upset the professional archaeologists and set off within the scientific community and museum world a controversy over the accuracy of the kind of dating. Retesting was done, and it was announced that because of the anomalous factors in the clays, it was impossible to determine an accurate date. Oh, they couldn't do it. However, the technician then contrived what the Hapgood is laying down here is a phony method of slapping a modern date on the samples by claiming that they could estimate the age with regenerated light signals. And then what happened, and what really got on Hapgood's nerves, is that these major institutions came on board and really tried to just discourage any interest in this find at all, because oddly enough, some of the pictures showed individuals basically playing with dinosaurs. And this gets very, very interesting, because there's a quote in the Cayce readings about how this whole thing about the dinosaurs being 65 million years ago is not accurate by a long shot. So let's just take a quick look at Hapgood and friends there. This is Hapgood in Mexico, actually, with the man who found the the son of the man who found them in the first place. And it's quite interesting. He's there with the writer for the Perry Mason show. And here they are among the ruins that have been kept in this museum and basically would not be acknowledged by archaeology because they showed things that clearly don't add up with the traditional story of archaeology, which is that, there were no indigenous people that could do this in that area at that time. And also, what are those dinosaurs doing in there? So in essence, what they did is they try to suppress the information. So a couple of interesting things happened in relation to this, which is when Hapgood was sponsored to go there, he ran across Peter Hurkos, who was down there. And somebody, Arthur Young and someone named Andrei Paharich, who's well known to people who study the Nine, they had him down there trying to figure out what these ruins were about and what the groups were about. And he said they're a very ancient lost culture and that there's a lot to find in relation to this. Later, Hapgood would go down there and do his own expedition and find his own relics that looked like this. So he was absolutely convinced, one, of course, it was not a hoax, and two, that it was intentionally being suppressed. So here we have this pattern of ancient cultures being suppressed and the rising Atlantis idea being suppressed, and these really advanced groups and this really advanced archaeology just being left out of the historical record because, in my opinion, it relates to the hot zone activity and what they didn't want people picking up on and researching. Yes.
Okay, I think you glossed over what happened there in Mexico a little bit. So
yeah,
some people may not know who Peter Hurkos is.
Yeah, well, I do actually. I have more. I wanted to get back to your question. So no, I haven't left that off. Keep rolling. I do. I have more figurines, and I have actually.
Go right into it, please.
Yeah, although we are going to stretch this into more episodes also. So don't. It's okay. We can still. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's more. There's definitely more with Hurkos. Okay, keep going.
Okay, well, Celtic Dove wanted to know, did Paula Zalitsky have any connections to the Hemingway family?
No, I mean, Zalitsky grew up in, she actually grew up in Poland and the Soviet Union. So she's really on the other end of the spectrum. And by the time she gets to Cuba, she is, we're in the 60s there and Hemingway has died. So there's nothing in the record to show that they crossed paths, although they were looking for the same thing. Interestingly enough. Yes, keep rolling.
Okay, so Kent Kristen wanted to know, so George Bush had oil platforms with Zapata oil right over this stuff.
That's
right?
True, yes.
And so was the Bay of Pigs also over the ruins? That's on the other side of the island, isn't it?
Well, it's very interesting. It is not over the ruins, but it is, it's more like the midway point of the island. What's interesting about that is, the Cuban Missile Crisis itself could have come about from several factors, but the tensions with Cuba being part of that, the incredible tensions with Cuba, a lot more than just about the Batista regime and the mafia and all that kind of junk that they roll out there. Of course, we wouldn't want a communist power 90 miles off of our shore. Absolutely. And there are regular geopolitical reasons why they wanted control over Cuba. But, and certainly the relationship with Castro when he came into power. Originally, remember, he was a friend. He came over here. There's a picture of him in New York at NYU giving a speech, and he came and spoke at the UN and stuff. And, Nixon, the VP, met him and everything was hunky-dory. And then when he went back, he suddenly became communist and had Khrushchev backing him. So something had happened there. Nobody's really understood it because he was independent when he started. So that became a shock to everyone, and Kennedy inherited that tense situation. But what we have to say is unusual is that Hemingway's information was there and evolved, and that there were all these bizarre shenanigans that made their way into a national security document about this national security incident at Hemingway's villa. And let me tell you something, there is nothing that explains the presence of Jack Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and the CIA director in conversation over that with Ed Lansdale. there's just no explanation for it. Some of the best historians, like Arthur Schlesinger, looked at it and said, I have no idea what they're talking about. So there was something of national security interest at Hemingway's villa in Cuba. And eventually it was smuggled out of there on a shrimp boat under the Kennedy administration. Very, very unusual story. And they try to give us the story later that, well, this is Hemingway's stuff and it's at the Kennedy Library now. And oddly enough, at the Kennedy Library, there is a massive Hemingway exhibit. But there was a strange relationship there between the Hemingways and the Kennedys, which we brought out in those episodes. And that relates so much to this hot zone activity. But again, it's still a major secret. So it's, 50 years later, and people still don't know the details of what happened there. One quick thing I do want to point out, since I mentioned Hurkos, as Olivia pointed out, this is Peter Hurkos. Very well known for his work on the Boston Strangler case, interestingly enough. Hurkos was from the Netherlands, and he was actually a house painter. And
I love this story.
Fell 30 feet off of his ladder. And isn't it fascinating? And when he was in the hospital, he woke up with this strange ability where he could see people's future, and he could see all these, his vision had changed, and he had developed this incredible psychic power. There are a number of psychic powers, psychics out there who develop their power by having some sort of an accident as a child, and or as a grown person. And I believe he was about 20 when all that happened. But the tremendous knock that he took to his head gave him this incredible ability. And it was funny because Hapgood recounts a story that when he meets Hurkos takes his wallet and looks at his children and tells them their health condition, their disposition, their future. And Hapgood is absolutely amazed because everything that he says is exactly spot on right. So quite remarkable. The man that he is with and who sponsored Hapgood to go down there in the first place is Arthur Young. Now, Arthur Young, being the person who developed the Bell helicopter, and we know that the Bell helicopter company eventually had on their board Walter Dornberger, who started the X series of planes. And whenever we get around the X and the secrecy around the X development, Dornberger is right in the heart of it. But Arthur Young there, being at Bell Helicopter and then being a theosophist, being deeply into the spiritual realm, he marries Ruth Forbes Payne. This is all very interesting because Ruth Forbes Payne is the mother of Michael Payne, and Michael and Ruth Payne will host Lee and Marina Oswald when they come here. So something very strange that is military, CIA, and psychic all blending in one huge role here. Yeah,
this is amazing. We're learning so much about Jim Roy. Jim Roy says, I was hit in the head by a little league foul ball when I was 8. Been psychic ever since.
Oh, okay.
When I first heard about Peter Hurkos, I have to say, it's sort of tempting. You wish something would happen. So it's, it does happen. It's incredible.
It looks like it can go either way, right? You can get hit on the head and then things aren't going to go very well for you either. So you're very lucky, Jim Roy, that happened to you. I know in the case of Edgar Cayce that he was actually in a baseball game when he was 14, and someone threw the bat at him from behind, and it hit the base of his skull, and he acted very unusual that whole day. And then when they got him home, he was completely freaked out, and he had gone into some kind of a coma, and they had him there. They didn't know what to do with him, and that's when he gave his first reading in a different voice, and he said, you need to put a poultice at the base of my brain to reduce the swelling. And they were like, what's going on? But they did it, and he survived. So there's no question. It's almost like this blunt force can awaken. These people probably have the psychic ability that's waiting to be awakened, but it just so happens. All.
That's the whole.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it might give a tremendous shock to the pineal gland, but don't try that at home.
No.
Okay. And Arthur Young, I think, is a very complex figure. Let's go into his past a little bit more. Young and his wife got involved in channeling this group called the Nine. Now, there's a lot of information about the Nine out there, and Andrei Proharich is famous for bringing forward two of the major psychics, Peter Hurkos and Uri Geller. And we know Uri Geller was very caught up in being John Lennon's best friend in the 70s, that he was very caught up in this whole Atlantis rising thing. And John Lennon actually and different people bought lots in the Atlantic Ocean for when it would rise. So there was a lot of inside information about this whole Atlantis rising thing. It went underground in a major way, but it was certainly there. There's no question about it. But Uri Geller was, the guy who's famous for bending spoons, and he was part of
Stupendous Yappy.
Exactly, it's true. He was part of the remote viewing team that they assembled at SRI with Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, and we did a tremendous 2-part interview with Russell Targ that's available for everyone. And his movie Third Eye Spies is finally coming out. He's 84 years old and he still does a remarkable job. And he actually put me on the spot and made me do remote viewing on the spot.
And you did great.
I did well, as it turned out. But thank God, because I was like, oh boy. He was like, what am I holding in my hand right now?
Mm-hmm.
This is all I need. I'm thinking of the interview and everything else, but it was the whole process was very interesting. And we've gotten quite a lot of information from him. But one of the interesting things I think about all this is that when we look at the kind of character of Proharich, he's very unusual because he's very interested in spiritualism, but he's also part of the military-industrial complex, military intelligence programs. So he's obviously a plant as much as he has his own interests. But Young is a different story. He, of course, being deep in the military and being part of Bell Helicopter also. But there's something about this group, again, that I think it's a mix of things. Just like I was talking about how the Hapgoods, Charles Hapgood and his cousin Beth Hapgood, who was very much like his sister, even though they were like a decade apart, they worked on a lot of the same things. And the sister started a commune here in Western Mass, which was the largest commune, on the eastern side, on the East Coast, period. This whole, and it was like a hippie commune. And
Spirit in the flesh.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about it, there is information about that. And Elwood Babbitt was associated with it also. And they had these great ideas and things, but it fell apart because there was young management of the whole thing and they were greedy and they wanted to be rock stars. But you can see these efforts to connect mystery school ideas on a real world level by the Hapgoods and by these other groups. Young, although he was deep in the military intelligence complex, and although he was deep in these different kind of things with Bell Helicopter and all the rest, there's some yearning from Young and his family to achieve something with this. They create these mind institutes to move the culture forward. So there's a great mix there of people who will take advantage of this information and people who will try to move the culture forward with it. I observe that clash going on a regular basis. Steiner referred to it as the battle of the mystery schools with the left-hand schools. And we have to kind of keep that in mind as we do this activity. And I'll remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're getting deep into the hot zone right now. And when you get into the hot zone, it gets very, very murky because the hot zone, which is this region now between Cuba and Bimini, is the site of these amazing ruins, but also very unusual activity, including massive UFO sightings, and also apparently, according to these whistleblowers from AUTEC, land masses appearing and then disappearing. How do you get that? That's a skilled radar operator too, by the way. He's somebody who had a long record working with AUTEC. How does a landmass show up on a radar? What is the mechanism for that? Is that what Cayce's talking about when he talks about Atlantis rising? It is all really fascinating when you think of it this way.
There are a couple people who are mentioning that High Brazil appears and disappears.
True. That's an interesting one too. And that was kind of a substitute for Atlantis that people were familiar with, HY Brazil. And I think that's where we get the name for Brazil, actually. Also, in my research, I found out that the original name for Antarctica was Australia. and that at a certain point, since they didn't have things rolling up to speed with Antarctica, when they, were kind of getting things going with Australia, they were like, "Hey, let's name that Australia," instead. So they just kind of
It's so
took
weird.
the name straight up and transferred it. Very unusual history there, and I'm trying to find even deeper pieces on that. I'm reading about the early expeditions. But one thing I want to say about Young is this, and we have to outline this just to show how these deep state political connections are so tightly wound up with the mystical appreciation of things like the hot zone in Atlantis. Think about this. Arthur Young develops Bell helicopter from a weird vision that he has, by the way, as a scientist. Then Bell helicopter goes on to recruit Walter Dornberger to create the X series of planes, which is where you get a lot of the modern X steganography in aerospace. Young's stepson is Michael Payne. He and Ruth Payne will host the Oswalds. Oswald will get accused of the JFK assassination, and all the evidence that convicts him in the public eye, although it never went to trial because he was killed, comes out of the Payne household. It's quite remarkable. It's quite a remarkable circle when you think about it. And then when we get further and we look at the fact that Young sponsored Hapgood to go to Mexico, they're deep in the research, these people. And there's some faction, like the faction that was behind the Kennedy assassination, like the faction that we call the Deep State now that Peter Dale Scott told us of. That faction is definitely active on the side of mystical transformation. That's why we get in the CIA so much study around remote viewing. We get so much study around psychic experience. Recently, there was a major FOIA request, and they found out, hey, the military is spending all this money studying things like dimensions and UFOs and psychic activity. So understand it's just a given when we break through that wall. The only reason that they ridicule these things in the public eye is because they want to keep any serious researchers off that trail and without the support that they need. Just like the hot zone situation with the city sitting under Cuba, where's the front page story? When it first hit, they couldn't control it, so it had to be a front page story. Where is it now? The majority of it was found in 2001. It's 18 years later. Why don't we know anything else about this mysterious city in the hot zone off Cuba? It's really quite remarkable. But figures like Arthur Young, Puharich, and the way that they use psychics, you notice that they're using Hurkos in this case when they go to Mexico and they look at these ruins. They'd use Uri Geller later. Well, earlier on, they're studying off of the Cayce information. And they're very concerned that this stuff is out there because these groups that operate inside the deep state and that operate to move the culture forward are two different groups, and the same forces, the same interconnections of these families. One group inside of those elite families might be trying to help get this information out, might be trying to help move the culture forward. And I've identified the two groups on a kind of an institutional level as X Protect, which is a group that shuts off anything related to the UFO file by discrediting the individuals involved, and X Share, who are the people who want to share that information with the public in other countries and move the culture forward. Those two forces show up over and over again when we get into this. So we have to kind of get the vernacular down to understand who we're talking about. There's no question when we look at people like Thomas Townsend Brown, for example, he's more on the X Share side. He's moving the culture forward. He's getting the material out. That's the role of a scientist. X Protect, I think we understand that best by individuals who've run the CIA, like Richard Helms. These are the types of people who will take that information and really suppress it and distort it for the public, which is why whenever we get the CIA around the UFO file question or they roll out Luis Elizondo or somebody like that, just say no. You have that ability. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Well, I'm just going to throw a wild card out there. So
Yes.
Brenda Jimenez wants to know why IBM was so eager to test the quartz sphere found by the treasure hunter off the shore of Cuba by Bimini Road.
Well, there's a lot of very unusual military contractors out there. Just like we had a contractor for Lockheed Martin at Antarctica. And, you know, what I also found strange was that NASA was down there off Bimini testing ocean currents. Seems like an odd thing. I mean, certainly, you know, yeah, a lot of NASA's landers have to land in the ocean and all the rest. But it just was odd, you know, just like the presence of Cape Canaveral. I think that they understand those things that we would call ley lines and magnetic currents running through the earth and veins running underground. Those are the types of surveys and the things that the ancients understood. And now we have a modern version of that with where these things are placed. Obviously, when you get into things like the Bermuda Triangle, you're looking at something, some kind of apotheum effect that took place there that it still has an echo. There's an overhang, which is why you lose planes there. And, you know, we've had people come forward who've come through that and were almost lost, but weren't quite lost. And one of them was a pilot who went through it and just thought he was in this cloud that was kind of rotating. And he thought he was in there for 30 minutes. And when he got out, it was like 5 minutes and none of his fuel had been expended. So whatever it is, whatever kind of effects that are going on over there are studied on a deep level. And remember, I mentioned Thomas Townsend Brown in the last episode. Some of the information that came forward from his family was that when he would go off to San Antonio, it wasn't San Antonio, Texas. They figured out he was going to San Antonio, Cuba. And that's where we find Zalitsky finding her ruins, the westernmost tip of Cuba. So we have to kind of get our heads wrapped around what the hot zone is, I think is the answer to that. Okay, keep rolling.
Zach Gerard wanted to know, what is the mythological meaning of Atlantis rising? And I had another question. DJ, do you believe the collective unconscious of humanity has a role in the pole shift event? And I would say also Atlantis rising.
Yeah.
DJ would say so.
Yes, definitely. I think you have to take it on two levels. It's really interesting because one level is we take it on a flat scientific level. Somewhere in that zone between Bimini and Cuba, there are underwater ruins that represent the lost continent. And if there is a landmass rising off the East Coast there, then we're going to know because those ruins are going to rise or they're going to become more visible, and that's going to change history. And it's dramatic because if it's a very advanced culture, such as Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy or Edgar Cayce's work told us, then we're looking at a totally different situation of what history would be all about. So that changes all the paradigms. I mean, you know, they talk about how the alien thing would change religion and shake up the earth, and that would change the paradigms. That's why they hide it. Some truth to that, but I actually think that finding out about the hot zone and finding an Atlantis advanced culture, more advanced than ours, would be really remarkable, especially if it was a spiritually oriented culture, at least on one side. So these are real good reasons to suppress it. No question about it. One thing I wanted to point out that I found that I think is a gem is this is an actual parchment. And here is someone citing Plato's work on Atlantis in Greece just a few years after it was written. There. So that is Atlantis there on that second line back then. And we have to remember that Plato gave us the story of Atlantis not as a parable, not as a fable, but as a historical record. That's what he said it was. And, you know, Wikipedia or the traditional take on this from the archaeological side is, oh, he made up a story because he was unhappy that Socrates was dead. You know, I mean, you don't have any proof of that. The proof that we have is that he said relatives in his family passed down that story from an Egyptian priest. That makes more sense. He's putting it on the record. He's not saying that it's a parable. He's saying this is what actually happened. So it's historical. But the reason I think it's resisted is, again, there are these forces that just want to cling to this version of reality that they've created. They may also be afraid that if we do tap into that period, that there's a great awakening there to be had. And so it's much better just to dumb you down and to show pictures of cavemen. It makes life a lot easier. Hunter-gatherers, and I think people like Graham Hancock have blown that away. Let's see here. Have I covered everyone? Eisenhower, Einstein, Babbitt. Looks good so far.
You
Keep
did
rolling.
leave a little something out there about
no.
Castro.
The UFO Castro, I showed that.
Okay.
Yep. This is interesting. Atlantis means Antilia. It's a Semitic word. ATL means elevated. It's the root word behind Atlas and Atlantides, which is, that's the daughters of Atlas, the Atlantides. So Atlantis, the Semitic word root ATL meaning elevated. That's where we get the name Atlantis. Fascinating. So the ocean would be elevated. So that is quite interesting. I do feel that maybe what is going to top all this off, since we're talking about Castro, this is really interesting. What if I told you that part of the Cuban Revolutionary Manifesto called for interaction with the Space Brothers and UFOs? What do you think, Olivia? What
everybody catch that?
If we took the
Space
temperature,
Brothers.
let's take the temperature of that for a minute.
Okay.
If I told you that part of the revolutionary theme of the Cuban Revolution was reaching out to UFOs and Space Brothers, what would you think?
I'd say right on. And no wonder the U.S. had to do something about that.
But would you be shocked?
Yes.
It's pretty shocking. It's pretty shocking. Let me read it to you. It's a group, the Posadas group in Cuba, the Revolutionary Workers' Party. They're Trotskyist. And they fought alongside Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And it's quite interesting because I think Posada deserves a lot of attention because he was very into UFOs. And here's the section from the Revolutionary Workers' Party in Cuba, which helped overthrow the government and install Castro. Are you ready? Okay. It says, quote, this is from Posadas, "We must call upon beings from other planets when they come to intervene, to collaborate with the inhabitants of the Earth to overcome misery. We must launch a call on them to use their resources to help us." Cuban revolutionaries looking for UFOs to help them with the revolution.
Well, you know what stood out to me when you read that is the when, not the if.
Yes.
In the language. There's such faith that they will come.
Yes, that's a really good point, actually. He further said, UFOs could demonstrate the existence of agents able to master a very sophisticated technology, something that would be compatible with what on this planet was advocated by socialism. If UFOs existed, they could be allied in addressing some of the major problems on the Earth. This is quite remarkable. And then we tie this together now, that Cuban Revolution, there's a belief in UFOs there. When it's taking place, the revolution, they have a UFO sighting, according to these generals who wrote bios, Cuban generals. They had a UFO sighting that lit up a dark night, so much so that it was like daylight. That's the way he described it. So there's something extracurricular going on there in that region in relation to Cuba and leadership. And then we talk about the OTEC whistleblower saying this landmass was there suddenly. So there's something very unusual, I think, when we're looking at these pieces. We have to use more than just our traditional way of looking at this. So I think the original question was, if we're looking at a situation, can human consciousness impact the fact of Atlantis rising and all the rest? There's no question that they're completely related. But if we don't have any knowledge about it, that is, from a regular standpoint, even a scientific standpoint, if it's not reported, it's harder, I would say, for us to reach into that information. And people stay at this state where we're not aware. And if we're not aware of the hot zone, as has been the case for 70 years, it seems like the information around Atlantis and around Atlantis rising can be easily distorted, forgotten, or with disinformation abused. So I do think it's a major aspect, because the hot zone, remember, through AUTEC requires secrecy, military resources, control plans. That's operating in a very tricky neighborhood too. You're not so far from Gitmo either, right? Which is the piece of Cuba that we still control. So, instead of talking about elites going to Gitmo or something, as you hear as these memes get floated through the alternative research, how about we take a good look, since that isn't happening, how about we take a good look at what's going on with the hot zone in relation to that area? Okay, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Nimsa wanted to know, so was recovering Atlantis the secret arms race? And I think it's not was, it's is. Is it, right?
Yes, I like that, yeah. There's no question about it. I've done a number of dialogues with Dr. Joseph Farrell on what the phrase came out in those interviews, archaeological wars. I like that. And he talked about the Baghdad Museum looting and how unusual this was when it was taking place, and how it seemed very staged, and how also, though they were dressed in American, they dress up in American uniforms and stuff to get in there, it was very unusual. But the groups that were working in and around Baghdad on archaeological research were German before Desert Storm and all that. So it is very interesting that these German archaeological groups were very advanced, and then you had this huge looting. In terms of what they're looking for, we've talked before, and in the Edgar Cayce work, there are references to this amazing technology that the Atlanteans possessed. Now, they seem to take it on face value that material is something that they can make work. But because of the legends related to it, it's almost like they know something that we don't, which is that they're looking for a very advanced technology that existed at one point. Somehow knowing that gives them a great advantage. Is it because of the technology itself, or just the knowledge of it? There's something very unusual taking place in relation to the hunt for Atlantis by these groups. But I can tell you this, the groups definitely want to be first. They want to be the first ones to find it. So does that relate to a secret arms race? It certainly relates to a race between groups, and you could identify the groups as Russia, the United States, and some other European powers. To find this information, along with Cuba itself as a kind of autonomous entity, to get their hands on this hot zone information, because it is so transformative. And I believe they've been playing out a geopolitical game of chess with a lot of brinkmanship for 7 decades now. And I think that if you go back in history, you can find very unusual things, even relating to the Cuban earthquake that took place in the 30s, and the presence of so much submarine testing and all the rest around there. It's very unusual. A couple of quick quotes from Edgar Cayce here, and I'll remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're deep in the episode. We have time for a few more questions after this, and it's fantastic to have everyone here. And of course, this is episode 44, which is Atlantis, the Hot Zone, and Antarctica Pole Shift, Cayce Einstein and Charles Hapgood. I want to say that someone like Hapgood is very valuable there. We're more familiar maybe with Edgar Cayce or Albert Einstein. And the way that works is people like Hapgood can fly under the radar a lot, even though they do a lot of incredible work. And the reason is they're not there to take credit. They're there to move the culture forward. And I think someone like Hapgood, with the great scientific skills that he possessed, and along with his great psychic interest, the bringing together of those two things makes him a remarkable figure. And I think that his books on the pole shift, and also further on the maps of ancient sea kings, really give us an idea that there was a more advanced culture back there, and bring, kind of give back our heritage to us in that sense, which is very important. And that's exactly the work of the mystery schools. And I'll tell you, whenever you get around people like the Hapgoods, you feel the presence of the mystery schools working. And that includes Beth Hapgood. Okay, a couple of quick Cayce quotes. Here's a reading. The entity was then among those who were of that group who gathered to rid the earth of the enormous animals which overran the earth. But ice, the entity found, nature, God, changed the poles, and the animals were destroyed. Now they asked him, what was the date of this meeting? What were they trying to do with the animals? And he said they were trying to kill them with basically an enormous death ray. And the date was 50,722 BC. This is really quite extraordinary and opens up a completely different chapter that we have no idea about in history, possessing that type of power. But here's the weird thing. Earlier I showed you these strange ruins that were in central Mexico, and they showed these humans interacting with what looked like it's kind of miniature dinosaurs. And here he is saying, in 50,722, the entity was among those who were of that group who were gathered to rid the earth of the enormous animals which overran the earth. So he's suggesting here that in 50,000 BC, we're still dealing with dinosaurs. What's the disconnect? Why is it in regular history we're told the dinosaurs died off 65 million years ago? That's a pretty big gulf, 65 million years versus 50,000. And if they did disappear 65 million years ago, why do all those ruins in Mexico show these humans interacting with these dinosaurs? It's quite unusual. In speaking of pole shifts, there's a few Cayce readings I think of note. He does suggest that 2000 to 2001 is the process basically takes place, but he calls it a gradual and not a cataclysmic process. So something that is happening there, those poles switching out, according to Cayce, it's not this overnight thing that's happening, but it is a gradual, not a cataclysmic activity. Somebody asked the question, 300 years ago, Jacob Boehme decreed Atlantis would rise again at this crisis time when we cross from the Piscean era into the Aquarian. Is Atlantis rising now? Will it cause a sudden convolution? And about what year? Now, this is interesting. Boehme obviously was getting his information from the mystery schools. The Atlantis rising theme was there then. They were trying to prepare people then. Now, he was around in the 17th century. Okay. Cayce's answer. In 1998, we may find a great deal of the activities as have been wrought by the gradual changes that are coming about. These are at the periods when the cycle of the solar activity, or the years as related to the sun's passage through the various spheres of activities, become paramount to the change between the Piscean and Aquarian age. This Atlantis rising is a gradual, not a cataclysmic activity in the experience of the Earth in this period. Now, it's interesting because he suggests 1998 and then he says gradual. Instantly, everyone grabbed onto it and said, he says Atlantis is rising in 1998, but not if you actually read it. He's saying the process kicks off in 1998 in a big way. That's when the rising takes place gradually. Here we are 20 years into it. Now are we seeing aspects of Atlantis rising? Is that why the tensions are raging there? I think that's quite telling. And then there's one more that I want to read on this one, and then we'll take the last few questions. Yeah, I think actually it's the last one here. What greater change, or the beginning of what change, if any, is to take place in the year 2000 to 2001 AD? Cayce, when there is the shifting of the poles or a new cycle begins. So he's telling us that that pole shift activity is taking place and that it's been kicked off here. First, he said 1998 for Atlantis rising, and now 2000 to 2001 for the pole shift. Those two things are related, and they're both gradual, not cataclysmic. But nonetheless, even though they're gradual, what happens when they turn up? I mean, Atlantis rising, a pole shifting, everything is going to change in terms of the climate, in terms of the land masses, and in terms of our understanding of the past. These are dramatic changes that are being laid out for us, in this case by Edgar Cayce, but by Charles Hapgood, by Albert Einstein, and by figures like Elwood Babbitt. We've been looking at this. These people have been giving us this information. How far along are we with it? Did we blow it as researchers in the 70s and 80s and 90s by everybody saying, bam, it's happening right now? And using the instant shock thing, you know, we are the earthquake generation, late great planet Earth, all this stuff. They looked like, when you look at the mystery schools, they're talking about process. They're talking about this process has kicked off. It's gradual, not cataclysmic, but it's a big deal. So we're in the middle of it. These things are happening, and Atlantis is rising, and that's been taking place for a while. So what happens when it actually appears? Who's set up for that? These people, and the people who keep the hot zone such a secret, are studying it to such a length that they know what's taking place. They're studying it. There is absolutely no good public information on the hot zone, except for what Zalitsky brought forward. So we need more public information on this. We need public expeditions on this. We need research around Cuba, around the Cuban archives. And of course, one of the things that I brought up earlier was about President Eisenhower. And President Eisenhower, in looking for this map, the original Piri Reis map, he puts pressure on the Spanish government to find it. He's been convinced by Hapgood, who he exchanges letters with and has all this communication with. And Hapgood is able to put the case to him, we need that other Piri Reis map. President Eisenhower in the 50s is looking for the original Piri Reis map. Under Hapgood, who's working with Einstein, what are they looking for? What is it that's on the original map? I submit, based on the information, based on the tension with Cuba, that it's information relating to the hot zone. I mean, it might be nice to have, maybe Hapgood wanted it, but what makes it a national security affair that President Eisenhower gets involved? What makes it a national security affair to get involved at Hemingway's villa in Cuba by the Kennedy administration? Not even the historians know that one. The answer relates to the hot zone and the Atlantis rising. That's what makes sense, because it doesn't have any other function, really. And the information is so deep that even people who have defected from Autek have been telling us that. He's seeing these continents. Zalitsky came forward. She winds up in prison in Mexico, barely escaping with her life. It's serious. It's pretty serious when you get around it. And I think the hot zone material is the one really kind of core area that we have enough information on from the scientific side, from the mystery schools, and from this type of information, like the Cayce information, to really formulate a picture there of how to uncover this. We have scientific information on the ground. I mean, Zalitsky's charts, Zalitsky's experience, her graphs. How much more scientific do you want to get? That's where we go as a culture if you really want to get a handle on where this is moving to in the future. Okay, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so David Tormina, DJ, is
Yes.
Atlantis stuck in a time loop, a Apotheum effect?
There's obviously something interdimensional going on there. It's an excellent question. And look, the idea of planes disappearing, the guy who went through that strange cloud when he was in the Bermuda Triangle, and then came out the other side and he, basically no time had passed. It's very strange, the effects. We've seen, I remember reading this story from 1976 about a sea captain who's out there and this gigantic thing shows up and he thinks, oh, is that a huge boat? What is it? It seems to go on and on and on. And they're starting to get weird engine problems. And he just decides, let's pull out of here. I don't have any idea what this is. But he went on the record with it. And what was that? So the idea of apotheum in relation to that area is very prominent, which is why so many strange things happen there. It's not an easy to control area, even for the deep military people. I think that's why they have AUTEC there as a kind of underwater Area 51. But there's no question in my mind that, where Cayce says Poseidia had domain there around Bimini, between Bimini and Cuba. And we have these two ice stones that the Atlanteans used, those large crystal power stations. Obviously, they imploded on themselves, and they're still causing this apotheum effect. Absolutely plausible when you take the information to heart. Yes.
Zach Gerard says, Atlantis must have meaning, not just a physical place. This is for all of us to consider.
Yeah, I like that, actually.
What is Atlantis? We've got to crowdsource what this is all about.
Yes.
It's not just that humans have a lost history, that we're a species with amnesia, that we are capable of much more greater technology, greater civilization than we have now. But maybe if it is interdimensional, maybe that's the ultimate thing they don't want us to know.
Well, yeah, I mean, take the Mystery School's Atlantis story. This is what they agree on. There was an advanced culture, and they had high technology, and spiritually and psychically, they had abilities which we can only kind of think of as mythical now. That's a pretty intense body of work. So the idea that Atlantis is some myth that somebody dreamed up doesn't make any sense. There's a cultural memory echo of it, of a culture before the flood that was more advanced and that blew itself up in essence. And that cultural memory is our own memory. That's the collective unconscious that we get into when we get into people like Carl Jung. He's giving that we understand it somewhere deep in our own subconscious. The Cayce work is very much like that too. What is Cayce's work telling us? That we're connected to that reality because we might be bringing forward that reality again. There's a quote, actually, when Cayce is asked about this, what would it mean to understand Atlantis? What would the moving into the Aquarian age mean? And he says, and this is reading 1602, the full consciousness of the ability to communicate with creative forces and be aware of the relationships to the creative forces and the uses of same in material environments. This awareness during the era or age of Atlantis and Lemuria, or Mu, brought what? Destruction to man and his beginning of the needs of the journey up through that of selfishness. So what he's saying is we acquired those abilities technologically and spiritually in that period, and basically it was our own undoing. We did ourselves in, and now, we have we're building robots, and robots are taking jobs, and the culture's becoming transhumanist, and it's a confused mess. So we're moving into that. The mystery schools understood you're moving into this harmonic period. What is Rudolf Steiner's warning? By the time we get here, 100 years after his lecture, which was about 100 years ago, when you get to this period of time, all this stuff is going to come up again. The chance of anthroposophy is going to come forward again to correct the culture, which he thought theosophy and anthroposophy had failed because World War I happened. So the mystery schools have given us that greater understanding, I would say. And it is a consciousness level. I think predominantly I've stuck to the fact of how to look at it on the ground and also how they're incorporating the psychic info. there's a cosmological consciousness aspect to it, certainly, that you could look at and just see it from that angle. And we brought some of that in tonight, but I think it is good to remind us to do that. But certainly, we incorporated a lot of the scientific background and the geopolitical forces preventing that information from impacting our consciousness. That's what there's a block there. You know, I've told this story before, but working around mainstream media, I've noticed when they get certain stories or get up to a certain point, they get cut off. There's a choke point in the media. And very often local stations bring up these stories and they get up to a national level and the kill switch gets switched. This is how the hot zone story is. And this story of Atlantis Rising, there's a kill switch around it. It's kept off to the side. And I think if we can get a handle on that story, if we can get a handle on the ancient culture story, our own consciousness lifts up dramatically, which, you know, the whole point in culture is to advance our understanding, to advance our sense of ourselves, and to advance our own education. Do you see any of that happening in relation to Atlantis or the hot zone? No. Very few people know about it. We're lucky in this group here to be talking, you know, with what I call the ideas room there. It's not a chat, it's an ideas room. And we have this ability to kind of reach out and interact among ourselves. But really, you go far beyond this circle, and you're not going to find many people who understand the truth about Atlantis. It's very, very suppressed material. So we're lucky to have this opportunity, and it does kind of come out like a ripple effect. And we are standing on the shoulders of the mystery schools. People have put their careers on the line. Hapgood working with Einstein and then Eisenhower. You know, I mean, these are pretty major figures. Do you think that Hapgood or Einstein or Eisenhower are going to waste their time on something that isn't there? I don't think so. So we're definitely talking about something incredibly valuable. So we have to keep that in mind. And there's one last thing I want to say about Eisenhower. And I think there's a magazine out there that republishes some good articles. And interestingly enough, it's called Atlantis Rising magazine. And but they had one, I hope they're still publishing. They had an article in 2009 and talking about the search for this secret map of Columbus, which is how that larger Piri Reis map is referred to. So now, this is the letter they republished. This is to President Eisenhower from Charles Hapgood. Quote, the Piri Reis world map of 1513 and the lost map of Columbus. Hapgood addressing President Eisenhower. For several centuries, scholars have been searching for the lost map of Christopher Columbus. The map is referred to by Columbus' contemporaries and by the historian Las Casas as one he used to navigate by to the New World. In 1929, a map was discovered in the former imperial palace, the Seraglio, in Constantinople, authored by a Turkish admiral of the 16th century, Piri Reis. In the inscriptions written on this map, the author states that the western part showing the American coast, that's the hot zone, was copied from a map that had been in the possession of Christopher Columbus, but which had fallen into the hands of Piri Reis with the booty seized from 8 Spanish ships captured by him in a battle off the coast of Valencia in 1501. The Piri Reis map, a copy of which accompanies this memorandum, attracted the attention of President Kemal Ataturk and the American Secretary of State Henry Stimson, very interesting deep state player. In 1932, he asked the Turkish government for a color facsimile of the map and for a search of the Turkish archives and collections to see if the lost map of Columbus might not be found. The facsimile of the map now hangs in the map division of the Library of Congress, but the original Piri Reis map, worked from Columbus' own map, or a copy of it, was never found. The real map, based on Columbus's larger map, was never found. We now have the excellent reason to believe that the original map still exists, and in the Spanish archives, the reason that this map has remained so long undiscovered appears to be simply that it's very different from the other contemporary maps, and it's not at all what scholars would expect to find as a map of Columbus. It was well hidden this way. It's not a map Columbus himself made, but one he found in the Old World. Let's let that sink in. It should resemble the western side of the Piri Reis Map, that is, include the coast of America and the hot zone, if it can be found. Evidence of its present whereabouts came to me through my old friend and scientific collaborator James H. Campbell, who together with his father, a professional geographer, actually saw this map in 1893. I am enclosing a separate account of this incident in Mr. Campbell's own words. It seems that in 1893, at the time of the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the Spanish government built and sent to America replicas of Columbus' 3 ships. The caravels were sailed through the Atlantic and through the Great Lakes to Chicago. It was there that Mr. Campbell and his father were invited, as he describes in detail, to see Columbus's own map in the chart room of the Santa Maria. They had the map. In addition to the important purpose of clearing up many mysteries relating to the discovery of America, we have another purpose in asking that a search be made for the map now. Studies of the map by various scholars have shown that it contains many details that were not known to geographers in 1513. These indicate that the map must descend from the maps made in very ancient times, and that navigators discovered and explored the coasts of America perhaps a millennium before the Christian era. This, of course, tends to give support to the tradition that Columbus brought a map from the Old World. It seems that Columbus left the Old World with quite a good map of America in his pocket. Finally, the most remarkable detail of the Piri Reis map indicating its enormous age was pointed out by Captain Mallory some years ago. He stated that the lower part of this map showed the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, Antarctica, and the Palmer Peninsula. After 4 years of study, the map we came to recognize that Captain Mallory's statement was correct. But desiring the most authoritative checking out of our conclusions, we submitted the data to the cartographic staff of the Strategic Air Command. I attached this letter and so on. The Antarctic ice cap is at present 1 mile thick over the areas shown on the Piri Reis map. Consultations with geological specialists have indicated beyond question the truth that the data of the map is many thousands of years old. It seems that the Antarctic ice cap covered the Queen Maud Land coast not later than 6,000 years ago. The map information must have been obtained earlier then by either the Phoenicians or some unknown people. And he goes on, and here, his final word that I think is important for us to note: we have found in our long study of the Piri Reis map a number of errors which explain, in our opinion, Columbus's confusion as to whether Cuba was the mainland and his underestimate of the distance to America. Quite fascinating. And this is the material that Eisenhower acted on and tried through the Spanish and leaders of the Spanish when he had this meeting. And there's 16 correspondences with Eisenhower to get them to find this map, and they never produced it. Somebody has the map of the original hot zone in there, and there's a big anomaly relating to Cuba in it. That, to me, is a smoking gun from Hapgood to Eisenhower saying, you need to find out about this because of the hot zone information. And Eisenhower acting on it tells me that he knew it was a national security issue. So I think that this really gives us a full picture. And what we're going to go into in the next episode relating to this is the kind of history of the suppression of information coming forward from 4 different scientists about the hot zone, which is really going to be mind-blowing stuff. We're going to take a couple more questions here. You're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's fantastic to have everyone here. What a huge crowd, and fascinating questions coming forward. we'll take a couple now, and
Let's rattle them off fast so we can get through a few of them, okay?
Okay.
Because we have great questions.
Yes.
Bruce Wayne wanted to know, so were the strange lights Columbus saw related to Atlantis? Do you think that's the connection?
This is a good point, actually, which is Columbus on his journey to America. When he gets around that point, midway to Cuba, he's seeing they're getting UFO buzzing. So something very, very unusual about that part of the ocean, let's face it. And I do think that the place where they have Autek is interesting off of Andros because it's close to the tongue of the ocean. And that dips down so far that that's 6,000 feet below the surface. That's pretty major. So when you're going down that far, you know, just to speculate here, if you are an off-world civilization, pretty good place to keep a base. That'll keep you off the radar. Okay.
Okay, Tommy O, did Jacques Cousteau ever do research in the hot zone?
He did. You know, it's interesting. I think the political situation was so hot, and it would be good to confirm this, though. Remember that when Castro did the whole thing with Sidled, that's 98. But in 68, Sidled was there on behalf of the Russians, studying ocean currents, supposedly, off the western coast of Cuba. I believe that they knew those ruins were there. Remember that Ernest Hemingway's brother, Les, is one of the first people to identify those ruins in a plane going over Cuba, probably to meet his brother. And he said something had opened up when he looked over it. Maybe there was a hurricane recently or whatever, but he could see those ruins. So they knew there were ruins down there, and I believe part of this mission that they had of sneaking Sidled in to Cuba and really having her under this KGB control was to get her to find out about those ruins, and she instead defected to Canada. But for some reason, I think that Castro was aware of the story of her life and wanted her and her company exclusively to pursue the ruins off of Cuba because somehow her experience there convinced him, even though she had defected, that she would be the best person for the job. And I think everything in the record shows that she's an outstanding engineer and oceanographer. And so I can see why he made that decision, but it's still, politically, it's very unusual. Okay.
Okay, Matrix C. Mytech. Nixon was constantly down in Miami with his Cuban buddy, Bibi Rebozo.
Oh, yes.
We have a joke going about Bibi Rebozo. So Howard Hughes was in the Bahamas for a long time, too. Ike spent a lot of time down in Key West recovering from a heart attack and watching movies. So,
well, we also know Key West,
right.
Edward Lean Skalnin builds Coral Castle down.
And let's not forget, Nixon served as VP under Ike. So
yes.
How does he fit into all this?
Absolutely. It's fascinating. Look, you're going to find them closely associated with this information. Of course, Nixon had a complete entree to so many secret programs, including the CIA Blue Book, which is the real UFO program. But this thing about Atlantis, I'll tell you, it's even less understood or known than the UFO file because of course, the UFO file is included in it because of the massive sightings in that area. So there's something going on there that is being observed by different governments. And I'm not sure that they understand all the pieces and how they're fitting together. But there's no question that there's massive activity. And it's the highest possible figures. I mean, just think about the national security incidents. Even the national security incident of Eisenhower going to the Spanish government looking for the Piri Reis Map, Kennedy sending in national security people to extract the vault of Hemingway's from Cuba. I mean, it goes on, but there's something very, very unusual. And I think that there are traces on the surface that relate to it. And the work of people like Andrew Collins refer to Cuba and Atlantis, or Egerton Sykes. I cite this journal of research in Atlantis from 1952, where the Cuban Archaeological Committee decides Cuba was Atlantis. That reference is out there, but apparently the trick is that it's the sunken ruins. And the thing that Sidled identified so well is she said, look, there's a mountain range, an old mountain range between the western tip of Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula. That's the land bridge. And that's the part that went down. That's why you have this advanced culture there In Yucatan, that's the Mayans. And in Cuba, you have references to this in those caves. But in between, the really advanced culture went down. So I think there's a great amount of information there. We are actually going to take only 2 more questions. We're going to wrap it up. But Miss Olivia, you give me the best 2.
So there were a few people asking about remote sensing satellites and remote viewing.
Mhm.
And Hughes, Bigelow, Musk, etc., and what they know about what the private sector knows about.
No question.
Atlantis.
Well, now that we have to remember this. Okay, so the first real satellites go up, and we have Sputnik and all that in '58. So we're getting a lot more information on the ground. For people looking for Atlantis and off of Cuba, they get a lot more detail after that. And then the advanced, supposedly we can take picture, of someone's license plate in an underground garage from a satellite. So obviously they can penetrate very, very deep. And you have all these people who do this, hire out these services now to look over Egypt and find things and all the rest. And I do feel like there's going to be major discoveries made. And we hear a lot about off of Spain. They've been finding ruins underwater, etc. So there's no question that the technology is impacting the search. There is going to be a point of no return where they're not going to be able to hide it. And they're just going to have to announce the discovery and put their own spin on it. But that could be a while, and that also could be problematic, the way that it gets spun. In terms of remote viewing, it's interesting because someone who was out there was Joseph McMoneagle, and he was doing remote viewing for the government at the AUTEC site. But he was happy to report also openly and publicly that he saw craft operating underwater there that were not U.S. government craft, and that they were basically, they had every earmark of just being UFOs, and that he was doing remote viewing on them. Now, Joseph McMoneagle is one of the best remote viewers in the whole group that came out of SRI. So therefore, I think it's pretty significant that he was able to come forward with that. And what I think he was trying to identify was literally that he felt that it was an alien craft. I mean, he wasn't holding back and saying it was some advanced government thing. He thought it was an alien craft. For what it's worth, there's some remote viewing evidence right in the hot zone. Okay, we'll take one more.
Actually, no, we're going to take 2 more. So one quick one. The Joe Giovanni wants to know, is CERN speeding up the magnetic pole switch? Pole switch.
They ran a feature in The Onion today, which was CERN apologizes for destroying 4 interdimensional universes. People are starting to understand that the CERN thing is a runaway project. Now it has a $20 billion budget, and also that it's pushing forward an agenda that we have no idea about. So ostensibly it's for smashing particles, but now they're advancing it. They're trying to contact other dimensions. With the they want to do it 5 times the regular version, and we already had dramatic impact on the magnetosphere from its activity back in when they were tracking the magnetosphere and its relationship to the sun. They were getting really heavy duty environmental concerns, and they blew off a group of scientists who were addressing those political concerns in court. So there's obviously something very heavy duty about it. And they came out with these little mini versions of particle colliders, and they have a nice X right in the middle of them, of course, because that helps the lens. But when I was looking at it, I was thinking, it reminds me of the Firestones. Just like Cayce said, they had the main 2-eye stone, and then they had these kind of portable Firestones, maybe the size of an iPhone. But I do think that it's a runaway project, and I don't want to be superstitious about CERN. I think that there's enough genuinely, it's mysterious activity there, from mock human sacrifices to the strange kind of occult imagery that they use. And that with the fact that it's a sovereign entity, that we don't know much about who funds it, and that now it's going out with a $20 billion budget. It was originally $6 billion. And that they shut down one of their main ones because of some strange activity, and now they're building one 5 times as big. Ostensibly you have CERN and you have the Large Hadron Collider. So what we're talking about is the Large Hadron Collider, and the Large Hadron Collider, now they're making the new version, and that's 5 times as big. Of course, they have the Alice Collider, and all the references to Alice in Wonderland, and everyone who watches the X series knows that the episode that we did on Alice in Wonderland, that whole CERN Alice aspect, it's a very important interplay between what they're looking for and the kind of mystery school awareness that they have. Certainly people who run CERN are not in mystery schools, but they have the awareness of the symbolism being used. So I don't want to, I don't think it's enough to just say CERN's evil, they're letting, demons into the world or whatever. I think it's legitimate to say on one level, look, this is a very mysterious project. Who's funding it? And why is it, when people go to sue it, who are legitimate scientists, why isn't anyone concerned with the, environmental impact? They're concerned about everything. When it comes to plastic, right? You can't get a straw in Cambridge anymore, right? But CERN, which is blowing a hole in the magnetosphere every time they turn it on, they're like, oh, don't worry about it. We're finding the Higgs boson. Supposedly you already found it. So it's a very unusual thing. My actual understanding of it from talking to several experts is that it's a weapon program under the guise of scientific discovery.
That's the only thing that gets funding anyway.
It's true. Yeah, absolutely. We know scientific, real scientists go around on their hands and knees begging for something. And I think in the great grand scheme of things, as we look at it, CERN becomes more mysterious the less we know about it and the more that it gets funded. So yes, absolutely. And of course, we've done a series of episodes on CERN. I don't think we have many more answers about it, but they have shut down the Large Hadron Collider temporarily, and they are building this one that's 5 times the size. So yeah, something that has to be really smoked out along with a lot of the transhumanism. Transhumanism is coming down like Niagara Falls, and if we don't get a handle on it, we'll be swimming around in it. So at such a degree, we won't be able to separate and make real restrictions for it. So these are things these are the movements of culture we're going to see ourselves moving into. And trust me, we're going to cover that on this show dramatically in 2019. We'll take one more question before we say goodbye. It's fantastic to be here with everyone. I want to remind you that you're watching the Dark Journalist show, and to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, get on board, and make sure that you get updates on the X series shows coming up. You're not going to you definitely do not want to miss what's coming up in February and the incredible guests that we have coming up for you on the series. Miss Olivia, take it away.
Okay, Occult Fan. Could Atlantis actually exist above water right now in a parallel dimension, and by a mass amount of affirmative consciousness, could we move Atlantis into this dimension? Could this be it? I actually want to address this first, okay, because I saw my shaman this week. And I think that I think it's not about moving Atlantis down into this dimension. It's the idea is that we're moving, this is a form of ascension, moving up to their higher level of being. I think Gigi might agree with that.
That's very interesting. It is absolutely interesting. I'll tell you the way that I see it, which is you have 2 questions there, really. You have a kind of on the ground physical scientific reality question, and then you have a kind of a consciousness cosmological question. They're both valid, and they both they are both related. On a physical level, the idea of Atlantis rising is an on the ground idea that can be tracked. So that's one aspect. One weird aspect that falls right between the 2 definitions is the strange thing that the Autek whistleblower saw, which is a landmass where there shouldn't have been one. But it wasn't there the whole time. It appeared for a while. It was on his radar. And that's when he started to realize something was up. Now, how many people remember who take on jobs in the hot zone and see things like that are under NDAs where they can't describe it? Because remember, the person that I spoke to about it said that's one of the things in his agreement, which is if you see X, something relating to things in the hot zone that you're not supposed to see, you can't talk about it. So we do have a big kind of whistleblower issue there, which is how do you get these people to talk? But it is interesting because it suggests that the idea of Atlantis rising may not just be a landmass rising in the, off the east coast of America. It may very well be something that is coming in from another dimension. And it's funny because CERN is doing so much work about opening up these other dimensions. There's definitely something between the physical world and this kind of deeper cosmic reality going on there in relation to the rising. But if you want to talk philosophically also, this idea that our consciousness is raising and that we're moving into that Aquarian age, I think that is fundamentally the mirror effect that's taking place there. And I think what we have, honestly, is the failure of the culture at large to grasp the kind of legacy of the mystery school, presence in history, giving us these answers. And the more that we move into that legacy that they've left behind for us, even the people that like Hapgood have left behind for us, and Einstein and Cayce, then I think we can start to apprehend that reality in between, cosmologically, physically, and interdimensionally as well. Thank you so much, everyone. What a fantastic show. I can't even believe, and a very long show too, but it's great to be back. And we will see you next Friday at 7 p.m. And we have some very exciting things coming up for February. Remember, get behind the show, subscribe to the show. Now's the time to do it. Get those episodes in your inbox coming up for February. You don't want to miss them. Sign up for the free newsletter. That keeps us in touch. And I want to also shout out to Carly. Thank you so much for helping with the chat. Amazing. And her podcast, of course, is Dimensions and Beyond. You want interesting information, listen to Carly. And Najat, it's great to have you out there. Thank you so much. Let's see if I can do a couple more. Nimza, fantastic questions. Occult fan, excellent question. Catherine Harris, thank you so much. It's great to see you out there. We will see you next Friday, and I hope you have a fantastic weekend. The only question left, Miss Olivia, is what's for dinner?
I don't know what's for dinner. I am so thirsty, and I'm not, this may sound weird, but I want like frozen lemonade.
Frozen lemonade.
Does that sound good right now? It's hot under these lights.
I think it's probably, and
then some pizza on the side.
just to go along with it. Lemonade at night is probably some kind of a health regimen.
Yeah, well.
It's coming up. We'll see everyone next week, and thank you so much. There's more in the hot zone coming, and not just from me. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Limonata. Limon.